Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly through time, past glowing streetlights, past the hum of your ceiling fan, back to a night drenched in candlelight and ink. The year is 1600, and in a drafty English hall, you stand among merchants wearing ruffled collars and hopeful smiles. Outside, frost rims the glass panes while Queen Elizabeth I's courtiers whisper of new riches beyond the known world. You probably won't survive this voyage, but that's half the thrill. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know who's still awake with me. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You watch the Queen's hand hover over parchment, the candle flame trembling in the draft. Her quill scratches down a royal charter granting exclusive trading rights in the East Indies to a band of entrepreneurs calling themselves the Governor and Company of Merchants of London, trading into the East Indies. A grand mouthful for a venture that begins in cramped counting houses. Yet this single signature, so casual, so bureaucratic, ignites the chain reaction that will stretch from the Thames to the Ganges. The ink dries, the world shifts. You stand beside those merchants as they celebrate. They raise cups of spiced wine, unaware they've just cracked open history's most profitable Pandora's box. You can almost smell the cloves and peppercorns already, currencies in their own right. A mainstream historical fact. Elizabeth I granted that charter on the very last day of 1600, giving the East India Company a monopoly over all English trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. The Queen likely didn't expect her little experiment in capitalism to birth an empire. Outside, London stinks of coal smoke and horse manure, yet every ship bobbing on the river carries dreams of nutmeg, silk, and immortality. The company's first voyages are small, tentative things, wooden hulls creaking against cold waves, crews praying they won't die of scurvy or mutiny before sighting Sumatra. You can hear the wind clawing at the sails, the deck slick with salt and fear. Each voyage returns, when it returns at all, with sacks of spice that sell for fortunes. Every investor grows rich enough to build a mansion, maybe even bribe a lord. Greed, after all, is the purest compass. There's a quirky tidbit here. Early investors included Shakespeare's neighbor and a handful of tailors. Imagine the world's largest corporate colonizer founded partly on haberdashery money, somewhere between a tragicomedy and an Excel spreadsheet. And historians still argue whether these first investors had any clue what they were unleashing, or were simply chasing profit, blind to the moral and political fallout centuries away. You drift forward a few years. The company's ships creep farther east, competing with Dutch, Portuguese, and French merchants who already haunt the spice routes. Picture the map, jagged coastlines inked in uncertainty, a vast subcontinent shimmering beneath monsoon clouds. India, ancient, dazzling, intimidating. Yet for now, the company's captains keep their distance. They barter in the East Indies, modern Indonesia, dodging Dutch cannons and tropical diseases. The competition is cutthroat. Entire expeditions vanish, swallowed by storms or debts. But failure only sharpens British ambition. As you lean over the ship's rail, a sailor mutters superstition. The sea keeps her secrets, lad. He's right. Some of those secrets are floating graves of crewmen who chased pepper and found oblivion instead. Still, the company presses on, because spices are worth dying for. In London drawing rooms, society women dab cinnamon oil on their wrists while their husbands gamble estates on the next voyage. Wealth smells exotic, sweet, dangerous, addictive. You blink and decades collapse. The 1630s pass in a haze of sails and silver coins. Every year, ships set out heavier and return richer. The company builds trading posts in Surat, Masulipatam, and along the coastlines where palm trees lean over the water like conspirators. They learn local languages, forge alliances, and sometimes marry Indian women. Cultures begin to tangle in ways no one planned. On certain nights, English officers drink coconut wine under starlit skies and feel, for a fleeting moment, that the empire could be something humane. An exchange of goods and stories rather than bullets. But those nights never last. By 1640, you're standing in the humid air of southern India, watching an Englishman named Francis Day negotiate with a local ruler. Sweat darkens his collar. Flies buzz lazily around inkpots. After long hours of polite bargaining and concealed tension, Day secures a small strip of land, just a few miles of coastline, hardly worth a second thought. Yet this is the pivotal hinge, the first Indian territory to be owned outright by English hands. Upon it rises Fort St. George, its cannons pointed both outward and inward. The settlement that follows, Madras, starts as a cluster of warehouses and grows into a city humming with trade, ambition, and contradiction. At night, you stroll through the half-finished fort. The sea crashes against the walls. Distant drums echo from nearby villages. Englishmen curse the heat, their pale faces flushed like boiled lobsters, while Indian merchants count coins by lamplight. Somewhere a child laughs in Tamil, and the sound mixes with the creak of ship masts and the metallic clink of armor. This is how empire begins, not with declarations, but with paperwork and patience. Here's a small joke to keep you awake. Bureaucrats make better conquerors than generals, provided they can balance both ledgers and muskets. The East India Company learns this quickly. Its directors back in London care less about governance than about dividends. They measure conquest in percentages. Yet every successful shipment breeds appetite for more ports, more warehouses, more influence. Profit begets policy. Policy begets power. Historians still argue whether the British expansion in India was an accident of trade or a deliberate slow-motion coup. Some claim it was a necessity, protecting commerce with soldiers. Others see it as design, the inevitable hunger of capitalism dressing itself in red coats. Maybe both, maybe neither. You can't tell. You're too busy watching the fort's flag flutter against a tropical sky, feeling that odd mix of pride and unease that always trails ambition. As months turn into years, Fort St. George becomes a magnet. Traders, missionaries, adventurers, and fortune seekers flood in. Streets fill with languages colliding. English, Persian, Tamil, Portuguese, each syllable a tiny negotiation. The company establishes its own laws, courts, even jails. A corporation acting as a government before the idea of corporate personhood was even coined. Imagine being arrested by a company, your bail set not by a judge, but by quarterly profits. The sun sets over the bay, painting the water gold. You breathe in air thick with pepper, cardamom, and smoke. Somewhere inside those scents hides the future, both magnificent and monstrous, because every fort built here sends ripples back to London. Reports of untapped markets, letters pleading for reinforcements, rumors of rebellion. Each decision drawn in ink will soon be paid for in blood. But tonight, no one notices. Tonight, the merchants sleep easy, dreaming of silk and sovereignty. And as you drift above the waves toward the next century, one thought keeps you company. Small beginnings rarely stay small. The quill that moved so gently in Elizabeth's hand has become an invisible scepter reaching across oceans. The company's profits glitter like stars, distant, alluring, impossible to grasp. Yet beneath them, tides stir restlessly. India has not yet spoken. The land watches, patient as always. You, half dreaming, feel the weight of centuries settle around you like warm air. The journey is only beginning. The forts are rising, the spices are flowing, and somewhere far inland, empires old and new are beginning to collide. You wake to the roll of waves and the sting of salt against your lips. The year drifts towards 1650, and the East India Company's ships are still chasing a shimmering horizon of profit. You lean on the rail of one such vessel as it rocks through the monsoon swells, timbers groaning, ropes slapping, sailors muttering about Dutch gunboats somewhere beyond the mist. The company's ambition has turned restless. The Spice Islands are crammed with competitors, so English captains begin to glance westward, to the vast, complex land that glows faintly across the Bay of Bengal, India. The word itself hums with promise. Spices, silks, gems, and fables. You can almost taste cardamom in the air, though all that actually reaches your nose is wet rope and unwashed sailors. The British are no longer content being latecomers in the trade game. Every voyage sharpens the dream. If they can't dominate the East Indies, perhaps they can carve a niche along India's endless coastline. Historians still argue whether this shift was strategic foresight or blind luck. After all, the company had been battered by the Dutch East India Company so badly that retreat seemed the only sensible move. But sometimes retreat points the way to empire. On deck, the captain consults charts that look more like guesswork than science. Oceans sprawl across them like spilled ink. A compass twitches in his hand. To your left, a sailor scratches a crude mermaid tattoo into his forearm with a rusty needle, proof that boredom at sea is more dangerous than storms. Someone jokes that if the Dutch don't kill them, tetanus will. You laugh quietly, but keep one eye on the gray horizon. The ships that survive months at sea creep toward India's harbors like wary guests. Surat, Bombay, Calcutta, Masulipatam, names that will someday define British geography lessons, but for now they're just words carried on humid wind. The company begins cautiously, requesting trading rights from local rulers, promising mutual benefit and fair exchange. A few gifts, guns, silver, clocks, smooth the way. Trade begins to flow. Spices, cotton, indigo, saltpeter. The merchants smile. The local kings smile back. It all seems so civil. You walk the markets of Surat, where Indian traders in bright turbans haggle effortlessly with Englishmen sweating through wool coats. Piles of pepper, bales of silk, and stacks of blue indigo cakes crowd every corner. You reach out, rub a bit of dye between your fingers. It stains your skin like twilight. A mainstream historical fact. By the 1660s, English merchants in Surat were exporting thousands of tons of Indian textiles to Europe, fueling both fashion and fortune. Those soft fabrics clothed London's elite and bound them unconsciously to India's fate. And here's a quirky tidbit to slip in your mental pocket. Early company traders were required to keep journals detailing their expenses, including bribes. You could read an entire day's record that looked like this: 2 rupees to customs guard, 1 bottle of Iraq to interpreter, 1 silk scarf to governor's wife. Business proceeding favorably. It's bureaucracy meets bachelor party. But these gifts worked wonders. The company's men became masters of polite corruption. Back aboard the ship, as night slides in, you listen to tales whispered between deckhands. They talk of Calicut markets glowing with lanterns, of Mughal caravans stretching beyond sight, of the Portuguese losing patience and firing cannon at anyone flying the wrong flag. Empire, it seems, is equal parts commerce and chaos. You smile. If only they knew how large the chaos would become. Historians still argue whether the British had any intention of conquest at this stage. The evidence suggests they didn't. The men running the East India Company wanted trade monopolies, not thrones. But greed has a gravitational pull. You can't orbit wealth forever without being dragged into its core. By 1686, company ships are firing their first shots at Indian ports. Some call it defensive action. Others call it arrogance. You stand on the deck of the Return, cannon smoke in your nose, and wonder how defense always seems to smell like gunpowder. The bombardment fails miserably. Half the fleet limps home. But the idea of using force to secure trade has taken root. The company will soon own armies, territories, even entire provinces. For now, though, its officers tried diplomacy again, licking their wounds and counting their coins. In 1698, the British Crown grants the company permission to establish another trading base on the eastern coast. They choose a swampy stretch of land where 3 rivers meet. You wade through mud, watching as laborers raise bamboo scaffolds for warehouses and barracks. Mosquitoes feast on everyone indiscriminately: British, Bengali, goat. It's miserable, but profitable misery. That fetid land will grow into Calcutta, the beating heart of British India. You pause to note another small irony. The company's headquarters back in London occupies Leadenhall Street, its windows rattling with the same foggy drizzle you left behind. There, clerks with powdered wigs tally profits from places they've never seen. They debate coffee prices while men like you bleed in tropical rain. Corporate detachment at its finest. The company's new base thrives. Ships from London, Bristol, and Liverpool arrive stuffed with bullion, departing heavy with Indian textiles and opium. Somewhere, Queen Anne smiles at her balance sheets. You, meanwhile, stand knee-deep in the chaos of the dockside, oxen dragging crates, Indian brokers shouting in a dozen tongues, and a missionary yelling about salvation no one asked for. It's easy to forget amid this noise that India is not just coastline and commerce. It's a continent of empires, each with its own ambitions. The Mughal dynasty still glimmers over the north like the last stars before dawn. Their palaces gleam, their treasuries overflow, but the cracks are widening. Wars of succession, regional revolts, and the cost of maintaining massive armies have begun to gnaw at imperial strength. For the British merchants watching from their seaside forts, that weakness looks suspiciously like opportunity. You spend an evening in the fort's officers' mess, sipping something that tastes vaguely like gin, and regret. A newly arrived lieutenant brags that someday the company will rule the whole country. The older men laugh him off. We're traders, not kings, they insist. You know better. Every empire starts with someone saying those exact words. The night air smells of rain and musk. Somewhere beyond the walls, Indian musicians play sitar and tabla. The rhythm drifts through the palm trees like a question waiting for an answer. You close your eyes and think about the distance between London and this place. How letters take months. How decisions made in Parliament will echo here half a year later. It's a delay long enough for ambition to bloom unchecked. A quirky but true detail. The company minted its own coins in India, bearing both Mughal and English inscriptions. Imagine paying for curry with currency that can't decide who's boss. Dual authority on a silver disc. It's charming in a mildly tyrannical way. Historians still argue whether those bilingual coins symbolized respect or manipulation. Were the British acknowledging Mughal legitimacy or merely wrapping their flag in borrowed prestige? Either way, the message spreads. The company is here to stay. By the turn of the century, British forts pepper the coasts, Madras in the south, Bombay on the west, Calcutta in the east. Each settlement hums with the same rhythm. Trade by day, intrigue by night. Courtiers, princes, and mercenaries flow in and out like tides. You can hear deals being whispered in Persian, contracts translated into English, and the occasional oath muttered in frustration when monsoon rains ruin an entire shipment of saltpeter. A mainstream historical fact, again. By 1708, the East India Company had merged with its rival, the new East India Company, consolidating all English trade in Asia. One corporation now controls an empire's pipeline of wealth. Somewhere in that merger meeting, a man probably sneezed, signed his name, and created the most powerful private entity in human history. You walk the ramparts of Fort St. George again, older now, wiser perhaps. The flag still flaps, the markets still buzz, but something new stirs beneath the surface. The British are learning that to keep trade safe, they must play politics. To play politics, they need power, And power never stops at polite boundaries. You glance out over the Indian Ocean, glowing silver in moonlight. Ships dot the horizon, each one a floating ambition. The world feels both immense and terribly small. Somewhere in the dark, Dutch cannons glint, French merchants plot, and local rulers calculate whether the English are partners or pests. You already know how this ends, but for now, the story is still unfolding, still teetering between commerce and conquest. And as the wind shifts, carrying the scent of cloves and gunpowder, you realize something quietly terrifying. The East India Company has stopped being a guest in India. It's becoming a landlord. The year is 1640, still humid, still heavy with the perfume of the Indian coast. You stand beneath the shade of a palm tree watching masons and carpenters labor under the sun, chiseling, stacking, and cursing in multiple languages. Their hammers sing a new rhythm along the Coromandel coast, the rhythm of Fort St. George rising stone by stone. You can almost taste the salt blowing off the Bay of Bengal as you realize this isn't just another trading post. It's a foothold, a British heartbeat pulsing on Indian soil. The grant that allowed this miracle came from a local ruler, a man who likely thought he was just doing business, not rewriting geography. Francis Day, the company's agent, had negotiated cleverly. A few chests of silver, a promise of friendship, and voila! The English had their own patch of land. Not borrowed, not leased, but owned. Historians still argue whether that ruler knew the long shadow he'd cast over centuries to come, or if he saw only the immediate profit. Either way, that small signature was destiny, dressed as paperwork. You wander through the half-finished fort. The walls are rough, smelling of lime and seaweed. Cannons squat on earthen mounds, their muzzles pointed toward the ocean, not because anyone fears India, but because European rivals lurk beyond the waves. Dutch ships stalk the horizon like sharks, and Portuguese frigates still cling to Goa. Everyone is armed, everyone's suspicious, everyone's sweating in armor not designed for tropical weather. A mainstream historical fact: Fort St. George became the first British fortress in India, marking the beginning of direct territorial control on the subcontinent. From this base grew the city of Madras, today's Chennai, one of India's great metropolises. But back then, it was just dust, disease, and a dream of profit. You stroll past warehouses stacked with cotton bales, pepper sacks, and barrels of dried fish. English clerks with parchment skin and nervous eyes record every ounce, every rupee. Somewhere, a cook boils water for tea, a beverage no Englishman yet drinks daily, though in a few decades, it will define them. It's funny to think the seeds of that addiction are brewing right here in the sweat and noise of Madras. A quirky tidbit: the fort's design included a tiny Anglican church, St. Mary's, which would later host the wedding of Elihu Yale, the man whose donations helped found Yale University. Yes, the future American Ivy League owes part of its origin to the tropical humidity of southern India. History is nothing if not a tangled web of coincidences and irony. Night falls early here. The air hums with insects, and the walls of the fort glow orange in lamplight. You can hear distant temple bells from the native town that's already blooming outside the British enclave. The locals call it Chennapatnam, a name that will fuse with Madras over time. Inside the fort, Englishmen dine on salted beef, their conversation bouncing between boredom and ambition. One complains about the heat melting his wax seals. Another brags that he's found a way to distill drinkable rum from rice. You laugh quietly. Necessity, after all, is the mother of intoxication. At the head of the table sits the company's agent, face flushed from the day's sun. He reads aloud the latest dispatch from London, the parchment stained by sea spray. Profits increasing, expansion encouraged. Maintain peace with natives unless necessary otherwise. You can almost hear the corporate heartbeat in those words: steady, amoral, and efficient. Historians still argue whether these early company men saw themselves as colonizers. To them, this was logistics, not empire. The flag fluttering above the fort wasn't meant to signify sovereignty, only security. Yet one can't help noticing how flags, once raised, seldom come down voluntarily. A tropical storm gathers on the horizon. You climb the ramparts as wind howls through the palms. Lightning flashes over the bay, illuminating the masts of anchored ships. The storm tears through the fort, rain drumming on wood, waves smashing against stone. You hold your breath as the flag strains on its pole, snapping wildly in the wind. When dawn comes, it's still there, tattered but upright. You realize that's the perfect metaphor for the British Empire to come. Weathered, stubborn, unwilling to fold even when the heavens themselves protest. When the sun returns, it brings visitors. Indian merchants in white cotton robes and gold earrings arrive with samples of silk and gems. Their camels and bullocks wait outside the gate, patient as statues. Negotiations unfold in a mixture of Tamil, Persian, and broken English. Everyone smiles too much. Everyone calculates. The English pay in silver, the Indians deliver goods. Both sides walk away thinking they've won. That's how the company likes it. Peaceful profit is cheaper than conquest. You stroll through the bazaar that's sprung up beyond the fort walls. The air is a collage of scents: cardamom, sweat, wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of jasmine. English sailors barter for mangoes. Indian traders inspect British muskets. Children chase each other through puddles left by the rainstorm. You watch, half amused, half uneasy, sensing that this mingling is fragile. Cultures rarely collide this quietly for long. A mainstream fact again. Fort St. George quickly became the administrative and military nerve center for the company's operations in southern India. From here, contracts were signed, troops dispatched, and taxes collected. Its council acted as both government and board of directors. Imagine a corporation with cannons and its own legislature. Modern business ethics would have a heart attack. One night, under a moon that looks like polished ivory, you share rum with a company officer named William Methwald. He confides that his real ambition isn't wealth, but immortality through maps. "If we chart the world," he murmurs, "we own it." You raise your cup to him, unsure whether to toast or tremble. Methwald later negotiates the lease that secures Bombay for the English, a city that will outshine even Madras. The man gets his immortality, though not the way he intended. A quirky aside, early British residents struggled comically with India's wildlife. Letters survive describing crocodiles stealing laundry, cobras invading kitchens, and one memorable note about a monkey that learned to open brandy bottles. The struggle between civilization and chaos sometimes smelled suspiciously like wet fur and spilled alcohol. Historians still argue whether the British succeeded because of discipline or because of sheer audacity. The Dutch were richer, the French more diplomatic, the Portuguese more entrenched. Yet somehow this awkward island nation kept punching above its weight, armed with ledgers and gunboats. Maybe it was timing, maybe it was luck, or maybe it was that peculiar British talent for turning misfortune into policy. By 1700, the skyline of Madras bristles with warehouses and watchtowers. Ships unload by the dozen, carrying textiles to London and returning with muskets and officers. Indian weavers in nearby villages work day and night producing cloth destined for European wardrobes. Their wages barely change, but in England, fortunes bloom. You can almost hear the ticking of a global machine. Every loom, every cannon, every ledger page synchronized to the company's profit clock. You climb once more to the fort's rampart. Below you, torches flicker along the streets of the Black Town, the native quarter. And inside the walls, Englishmen sleep under mosquito nets, dreaming of dividends. The breeze carries whispers, Dutch curses, Tamil prayers, English snores. The empire is already murmuring in its sleep. A single lantern burns in the council room. Inside, a clerk tallies numbers under candlelight. unaware that the ink staining his fingers will someday stain maps red. You watch his pen glide, swift, precise, unstoppable, and think of Elizabeth's quill back in 1600. The handwriting hasn't changed, only the scale. The moon dips behind clouds and rain begins again. You close your eyes and let the patter lull you. The sea breathes against the rocks, rhythmic as a heartbeat. Somewhere beyond the surf, another ship approaches, its hull full of silver and its captain full of ambition. You know what's coming. More forts, more flags, more friendly agreements. The subcontinent won't remain patient forever, but tonight it sleeps, just as you do, under the uneasy lullaby of empire. You drift into half-dreams of sails turning into maps, of ledgers morphing into laws. Fort St. George stands immovable through them all, its cannons rusting slowly, its purpose hardening. The age of merchants is transforming into the age of masters, and you are standing right on the fault line. For now, breathe. The storm has passed, the lantern still glows, and history keeps its secrets close. But you'll learn soon enough. Once you own land in a foreign world, the land begins to own you back. Morning breaks over Madras, and you wake to the sound of gulls screaming and the thud of crates being dropped onto the docks. The fort smells of salt and wet rope, of cinnamon and gunpowder. Fort St. George is no longer a lonely outpost. It's the humming heart of a network that stretches like spider silk along the Indian coastline. Every day, ships arrive from London, Bristol, and Portsmouth, their bellies swollen with silver, their sails frayed from months of ocean wind. Every night they leave again, heavier with spices, silks, and dreams of profit. You walk through the bustling streets outside the fort walls, where Indian merchants, Arab traders, Armenian middlemen, and English factors haggle beneath awnings made of stitched canvas. The air itself feels alive with ambition. Somewhere, a British sailor is bartering his boots for mangoes. Somewhere, a Tamil spice seller is counting rupees with calloused fingers. You smile. If capitalism had a cent, this would be it. The English are still newcomers here, yet they act like the hosts of an elaborate dinner party. Their forts multiply. Fort William rises in Bengal. Bombay grows from fishing villages into harbors. These aren't castles, but warehouses with cannons. The architecture of commerce defended by gunpowder. A mainstream historical fact. By the mid-17th century, the East India Company had become one of England's richest enterprises, exporting Indian textiles, pepper, indigo, and saltpeter. In London, its stock value outshone even royal treasuries. Shareholders who'd once been humble merchants now dined beside dukes. India's goods were feeding not just Europe's appetite, but its sense of destiny. And here's your quirky tidbit. Saltpeter, a key ingredient in gunpowder, was one of India's most profitable exports. So yes, the British literally bought the raw materials for their own conquest from the same people they would later conquer. It's the sort of irony history specializes in. As you wander through the fort, you notice a new kind of confidence in the air. The company men are no longer simple traders. They are administrators. They collect taxes, adjudicate disputes, even mint coins. They have uniforms now, long coats of blue or red, swords clinking as they stride past. You can tell by their posture, they no longer feel like guests. A meeting is underway inside the council chamber. You slip in quietly. Around the table sit men in powdered wigs, their faces slick with sweat. The topic? Expansion. The fort's warehouses are full, profits are soaring, and the directors back in London are urging more investment. A clerk unrolls a map of the subcontinent across the table. Rivers snake through inked jungles. Kingdoms are shaded like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be claimed. One man taps Bengal with his pen. Here, he says, is the richest soil in Asia. The others nod. Somewhere outside, a thunderclap rumbles. Historians still argue whether these early ambitions were conscious empire building or the natural drift of profit-seeking. After all, the company's directors weren't generals. They were accountants, Yet, accountants have a funny way of conquering the world when the numbers demand it. Later that evening, you stand on the fort's parapet as the sun sinks behind the palms. A ship from London is docking, and you can hear the creak of its ropes and the splash of anchor chains. Among its cargo, barrels of ale, crates of muskets, and a single harpsichord ordered by the governor's wife. The fort is turning into a little London, brick by brick, note by note. English gardens bloom beside banyan trees. Anglican hymns mix with temple bells. Empire, it seems, is less about armies and more about habits. Tea at 4, ledgers at 5, a sermon at 6. But beyond the walls, a different rhythm beats. Indian weavers sit cross-legged at looms, spinning cotton for British export. Their fingers blur. Their pay stays meager. Caravans of bullocks carry the cloth inland to be dyed, printed, and stitched before returning to the ports. You watch them move across the plains like veins pulsing toward the coast, a living network feeding the company's heart. A mainstream fact again. By the late 1600s, India supplied about 1/4 of the world's textiles. From fine muslins of Bengal to sturdy calicos of the South, British fashion depended entirely on Indian craftsmanship. When you buttoned a shirt in London, you were touching the ghost of a weaver from Dhaka. The British are not alone in this feast. The French East India Company, founded in 1664, has planted its flag in Pondicherry, just down the coast. The Dutch still hold their strongholds. The Danes and Portuguese linger too. On maps, India looks like a checkerboard of European ambition. Yet the British play the long game. They smile politely, trade strategically, and let the others tire themselves out. You visit a dinner hosted by one of the company's senior factors. The table gleams with silver and sweat. The guests, English, Dutch, and Indian alike, sip wine and debate the price of pepper. One man raises a toast. To peace in trade. Another mutters, peace is just a pause between profits. You nearly choke on your drink. He's not wrong. Outside, rain lashes the palm leaves. The monsoon has come early, flooding the streets. A group of laborers wade knee-deep through water to reinforce the warehouse foundations. One slips, cursing, and laughs. It's just another day feeding a machine bigger than any of them can imagine. And there it is. The realization that everything here, the forts, the flags, the fortunes, depends on invisible threads, trade winds, silver coins, human labor, and human greed. Pull one and the whole fabric trembles. Here's a small joke before you nod off. If corporate greed had a soundtrack, it would probably be the rhythmic squeak of a ship's pulley. It's oddly hypnotic, until you remember every turn of that wheel means another shipload of someone else's sweat. Historians still argue whether this phase, the company's commercial bloom, could have lasted peacefully. Some insist it might have, if Europe hadn't been so obsessed with outdoing itself. Others point to the inevitable tension between trade and power. You can't control markets without eventually controlling the people who make them work. And so, the company begins to raise its own private army. Not yet vast, but growing. Mercenaries from all over India enlist under British officers for pay and plunder. They drill in dusty fields, while merchants tally profits in cool offices. A strange symmetry, isn't it? The sword protects the ledger feeds the sword. As night falls again, you stand on the dock watching a lantern sway at the prow of a departing ship. The glow fades into the mist until it looks like a firefly swallowed by fog. You feel a chill, though the air is warm. Something vast and unstoppable is moving. Not ships, not soldiers, but an idea. The idea that one company, one island nation, could reorder the world simply by mastering trade. Your last sight before the tide erases the footprints is the fort itself, walls gleaming faintly under the moon. Inside, someone is writing a report to London. Operations in India continue favorably. Opportunities abound. You know what that really means. It means expansion. It means war will come disguised as commerce, but for tonight, the fort sleeps. The palm leaves whisper, the tide withdraws, and somewhere in the dark, an English officer dreams of Bengal's riches. You close your eyes and drift with the waves, hearing the creak of ropes and the sigh of history unfolding. The empire is still just a rumor that smells like pepper, sounds like coin, and feels, faintly, like destiny. The air shifts, heavier now. Something in India's vastness is beginning to exhale. It's the early 1700s, and you stand at the edge of Delhi's grand avenues, where marble palaces glimmer like dreams that forgot to wake. The Mughal Empire still calls itself eternal, but you can see the cracks beneath the gold. Courtiers whisper, generals plot, and the peacock throne itself feels tired. The emperor's seal still commands obedience, but only out of habit, not fear. You can almost feel the tremor that runs through the subcontinent when an empire starts to fade. It's like the pause before monsoon rain, quiet, dense, waiting. The Mughals had ruled India for 2 centuries, stitching together a mosaic of languages, faiths, and loyalties under one imperial umbrella. They built mosques that touched the sky, gardens that tamed the sun, and tax systems that filled treasuries to bursting. But wealth, like fruit, rots fastest when it's sweetest. A mainstream historical fact. The Mughal Empire reached its zenith under Emperor Aurangzeb, whose reign stretched from 1658 to 1707. He commanded armies that marched from Kabul to the southern tip of India. Yet his wars, endless and expensive, drained the empire's lifeblood. When Aurangzeb died, he left his sons an empire too large to rule and too fragile to defend. You drift through the halls of the Red Fort as courtiers argue over succession. Their silks whisper like snakes. Outside the palace walls, farmers curse rising taxes while bandits prowl the roads. The imperial treasury still shines, but it's like a candle guttering in the wind, beautiful and doomed. Historians still argue whether Aurangzeb's religious orthodoxy hastened the empire's fall. Some say his intolerance fractured the delicate balance of faiths that had held India together. Others insist it was simple arithmetic. Too many wars, too little silver. You suspect it was both, ideals and coins bleeding out together. Meanwhile, to the south and west, a new rhythm is beating. The sound of hoofbeats and war cries echoing through the Deccan hills. The Marathas, fierce and tireless, are carving their own empire from Mughal flesh. You ride alongside them through dry scrubland, their banners snapping like whips in the wind. They strike fast, vanish faster, and demand tribute where emperors once ruled. Their leader, Shivaji, is long dead, but his spirit still gallops through his people's veins. A quirky tidbit: Maratha cavalry were so skilled that British officers later studied their tactics to develop modern light horse units. Imagine that. Empire learning from the very warriors it would one day crush. You pause on a ridge overlooking a burnt-out village. Smoke curls upward, twisting like a ghostly question mark. Beneath you, India is breaking into pieces. Princely states, rival kingdoms, hungry warlords. For every palace, there's a ruin. For every throne, a rebellion. And where there is chaos, opportunity blooms like fungus in the dark. Back on the coast, the East India Company watches patiently. Its merchants sip tea and pretend neutrality while scribbling reports to London. The Mughal emperor's influence wanes. Provincial rulers seek foreign trade and protection. The directors don't need to be told twice. They begin to pour money into diplomacy and, increasingly, muskets. You return to Madras and find the fort buzzing with gossip about the Mughals' decline. Clerks shuffle papers approving new alliances. Officers recruit more Indian soldiers, sepoys, whose pay is steady and whose loyalty is flexible. It's still business, technically, but business is getting sharper teeth. A mainstream fact again. After Aurangzeb's death, the Mughal Empire rapidly fragmented. Governors of Bengal, Hyderabad, and the Deccan became virtual kings. None could restore unity. Into that political vacuum marched the European powers, Dutch, French, and especially British, their sails fat with wind and ambition. You watch as the company's ships anchor off Bengal's coast, sleek and confident. Their holds carry trade goods, but also artillery. You can almost hear the logic that hums behind every decision. If we protect trade routes, we need forts. If we have forts, we need soldiers. If we have soldiers, we must use them. The slope from commerce to conquest is slippery, and the company has already taken its first steps down. At a dinner inside Fort William, an officer named John Company, yes, that's what locals now call the East India Company, as if it were a living man, laughs and clinks his glass. "We only seek peace," he declares, "so long as peace is profitable." Everyone chuckles. No one finds it funny. Historians still argue whether the British rise was inevitable once the Mughal center collapsed. Some say any foreign power could have done it. The French perhaps if they'd moved faster. Others believe the British had a peculiar advantage. Discipline wrapped in arrogance. Bureaucracy tied to a bayonet. Whatever the truth, you can see it forming like a thunderhead on the horizon. You travel north to Delhi again, now faded and vulnerable. Persian soldiers under Nader Shah swarm through its gates in 1739. You watch helplessly as they loot the city for days, dragging jewels and gold through the streets. The peacock throne, the symbol of Mughal glory, is carried off like a trophy. The marble halls echo with screams. The empire, once the richest on earth, is now a corpse robbed of its crown. A quirky but haunting detail. Nader Shah reportedly took so much treasure from Delhi that his men needed elephants just to haul it home. The plunder financed his entire kingdom for years. India's wealth was, quite literally, portable. You ride through the ruins afterward, stepping over shattered tiles and broken bangles. Smoke lingers. A beggar child tugs at your sleeve. Behind her, the red fort's domes glint faintly in the morning sun, hollow as skulls. The Mughal emperor sits inside, trembling, a ruler in name only. The British don't invade in that moment. They don't need to. They just wait. When empires fall, patience is the most powerful weapon. In the next decade, the Afghan king Ahmad Shah Durrani invades too, carving fresh scars across northern India. The land becomes a chessboard played by foreign hands, and each invasion pushes Indian rulers to seek allies, even if those allies wear wigs and speak English. You can almost hear the rustle of contracts being signed in dimly lit halls. Trade privileges, garrison rights, mutual defense. Every signature a quiet surrender. A mainstream historical fact again. By the mid-18th century, the Mughal emperor had become little more than a ceremonial figurehead. Real power was dispersed among regional powers like the Marathas, the Sikhs, and the Nawabs of Bengal and Oudh. This decentralization, though vibrant culturally, left India fragmented and ripe for manipulation. You stand on the veranda of a company factory in Bengal, watching boats glide down the Hooghly River under a bruised sunset. The water gleams red gold, as if the river itself carries molten empire in its veins. Around you, British officers speak in low tones about opportunity, about taking administrative responsibility for local territories in the interest of stability. You recognize the language of conquest wearing a polite accent. Historians still argue whether the British genuinely believed their own rhetoric about order and civilization, or whether it was simply a convenient story to tell investors back home. You suspect it's both. Humans have always preferred moral justifications for profitable sins. A soft rain begins to fall. The peacocks cry somewhere in the garden, mournful and ancient. You breathe in the damp air, heavy with jasmine and foreboding. The Mughal Empire's light has dimmed, and in the darkness left behind, a new flame flickers. Small, disciplined, hungry. That flicker bears the Union Jack, and soon it will blaze. You blink, and the smoke of Delhi fades into the dust of the Deccan. The year is slipping towards 1750, and India no longer has a single heart. The Mughal emperor's throne still gleams under its canopy, but the pulse of power has scattered, beating now in Maratha forts, Nawabi palaces, and the tents of ambitious generals. The land hums with the noise of shifting crowns. You can almost taste the uncertainty in the air, a flavor mixed of gunpowder and cardamom. You find yourself on the high plateau of Maharashtra, among the warriors of the Maratha Empire. Their banners flutter orange and fierce against the pale sky. Their horses stamp restlessly, their riders lean and proud, wrapped in cotton and courage. They are the inheritors of Shivaji's dream, a dream of an Indian power, Hindu-led and fiercely independent, uniting the land under its own rule. And for a moment, it almost happens. A mainstream historical fact. The Maratha Confederacy rose from regional guerrilla resistance to become the dominant military power in India by the mid-18th century, controlling most of the subcontinent except the far north and eastern Bengal. Their cavalry could cover 30 miles a day, striking fast, disappearing faster. No empire could ignore them, not even one flying the British flag. But tonight, as you sit by their campfire, the heat is more than physical. It's political. The Marathas fight not as one army, but as many. Each chieftain guarding his own pride, each province its own ambition. The crackle of the fire sounds a lot like fracture. And that fracture is exactly where the British East India Company will wedge its foot. A quirky tidbit, Maratha generals, for all their bravery, occasionally accepted company pensions to stay out of fights. They called it diplomacy. The British called it investment. History calls it foreshadowing. The company's representatives in India, Clive in Bengal, Stringer Lawrence in Madras, Eyre Coote everywhere else, study this landscape of divided power like chess masters surveying the board. They see opportunity in chaos. Where Indian rulers see alliances, they see acquisitions. You drift over maps laid out on wooden tables inside company forts. Lines of ink dividing India into territories that haven't even been conquered yet. You can almost hear the future whisper through the candle smoke. Buy what you can't yet take. Borrow until you can own. Historians still argue whether the Marathas could have unified India if given time. Some say yes. Their strength, their nationalism, their relentless mobility might have birthed a native empire to rival the Mughals. Others claim no. Too divided, too decentralized, too bound by loyalty to clan over crown. You look around the campfire at the proud, quarreling nobles and wonder if destiny ever had a chance against ego. Meanwhile, the East India Company is growing a muscle of its own, not in London's boardrooms, but here, in fields and forts, in men trained to obey for pay. A private army of tens of thousands of Indian sepoys led by British officers. Their muskets gleam in the tropical sun. Their drills echo with commands shouted in accented Hindustani. It's a strange sight. Indians fighting under English orders, defending English interests against other Indians. The logic of empire always begins with borrowed loyalty. A mainstream fact again. By the 1750s, the company maintained over 20,000 soldiers in India, financed entirely by trade profits. It was the world's first corporate military, a standing army that answered not to a king, but to a board of directors. If that doesn't give you corporate dystopia chills, nothing will. You follow the company's army as it marches inland from Madras, muskets glinting, red coats sweating through their wool. The British call it securing trade routes. Locals call it invasion with receipts. The Marathas watch from the hills, uncertain whether to fight or hire these foreigners. They choose both, depending on the day. One evening, you sit in a smoky tavern in Trichinopoly, listening to a French soldier boast. The French East India Company is no less ambitious. Their commander, Dupleix, dreams of a French India, a mirror to the British colonies across the ocean. Let the English sell pepper, he sneers. We will buy kings. And he does, funding Indian princes, arming rebels and marrying ambition to opportunity. The British, infuriated, do the same. India becomes a stage for Europe's grudges, a tropical echo of a Cold War fought in wigs and waistcoats. Historians still argue whether India's fate was sealed not by Indian weakness, but by European rivalry. The 7 Years' War, they note, wasn't truly global until it reached the Ganges. You can almost see it. 2 continents arm wrestling over one subcontinent, each using local rulers as proxies. You walk through a marketplace in Arcot, half empty after another skirmish. Traders count coins nervously while soldiers argue over who really controls the province today. A child plays with a musket ball she found on the road. Empires, you realize, are built not on grand strategy but on moments like this. Small disruptions multiplied until stability is impossible. A quirky aside. British officers stationed in India often moonlighted as amateur linguists and botanists. Between battles, they cataloged plants, compiled dictionaries, and named insects after themselves. Nothing says colonial multitasking quite like conquering a province before lunch and classifying butterflies after tea. You travel west toward Pune, the Maratha capital, where the Peshwa, chief minister and de facto ruler, holds court. The city hums with both prosperity and paranoia. British envoys arrive daily, bearing gifts and veiled threats. The Peshwa's advisors debate whether to ally or oppose the company. Some call the English useful barbarians. Others whisper that their smiles hide steel. Both are right. Outside the palace walls, artisans hammer silver into jewelry. Children chase goats, and temple bells ring through the dusk. Life goes on, stubbornly indifferent to the politics above it. But beneath the ordinary, history is loading its musket. A mainstream fact again. By mid-century, the Marathas had defeated the Mughals, humbled the Nizam of Hyderabad, and even raided as far north as Delhi. Yet within decades, the same empire would fall to the British, not through a single war, but through 1,000 small bargains that slowly dissolved sovereignty. You sit beneath a banyan tree as the evening breeze rustles through its branches. Across the plains, dust clouds rise where company caravans move inland, guarded by sepoys. They look less like traders now and more like an army in disguise. The red of their coats is beginning to outshine the saffron of the Maratha flags. You realize with a shiver that the tide has already turned, though no one sees it yet. Historians still argue whether the British success lay in superior technology or superior timing. After all, their muskets misfired as often as anyone's, and their tactics were hardly revolutionary. But what they had, what India's divided rulers lacked, was consistency. While Indian politics shifted with each generation, the company's ambition was immortal. It had no heirs, no jealous brothers, no courtiers, only shareholders. And shareholders live forever so long as the dividends do. Night settles over Pune, thick and velvety. You can hear distant drums, Maratha patrols keeping watch, and closer still, the faint clink of British sabers in the guest quarters. You smile grimly at the irony. The guests have already made themselves at home. A quirky little image stays with you as you drift to sleep. A ledger resting beside a sword, both gleaming in lamplight. The 2 instruments of empire lying side by side, equal partners in conquest. One kills bodies, the other erases nations. As dawn rises, you mount your horse and ride east toward Bengal, where rumors swirl of a young British officer named Robert Clive who's about to play the boldest hand in the company's history. The land ahead is green, fertile, glittering with rivers and rice fields, and utterly unprepared for what's coming. The age of cautious trade is ending. The age of calculated dominion is about to begin. The morning fog over Bengal smells faintly of gunpowder and wet earth. You can hear distant drums echoing across the Hooghly River as soldiers in mismatched uniforms shuffle into formation. The East India Company, once a fleet of polite traders, now stands as a private empire with ledgers in one hand and muskets in the other. You watch the camp stir to life, cooks stirring rice over open fires, sepoys adjusting their cartridge boxes, British officers pacing between tents with that curious mix of exhaustion and arrogance that only empire can breed. By now, the company isn't merely buying and selling, it's governing, or at least pretending to. Its forts look more like palaces, its merchants more like generals, and in Bengal, the richest province in India, this strange hybrid of commerce and conquest has found its crucible. A mainstream historical fact. Bengal, in the mid-18th century, was one of the wealthiest regions on Earth. Its fertile plains produced silk, indigo, opium, rice, and saltpeter, the essential ingredient of gunpowder. Whoever controlled Bengal controlled India's purse strings. And in 1756, a new Nawab, Siraj-ud-Daulah, decided the British were becoming far too powerful for his liking. You watch him ride through the streets of Murshidabad, proud and young, his entourage glittering in silk. His courtiers warn him, the English have fortified Calcutta without permission. He doesn't hesitate. Then we will unfortify it, he says. Within weeks, his army storms the city. The British garrison collapses, and panic sweeps through the company's settlements. You wander through the chaos of captured Calcutta. Warehouses looted, ships burned, terrified clerks clutching ledgers instead of weapons. Somewhere, the rumor of the Black Hole of Calcutta begins. A dark prison cell where dozens of British prisoners allegedly suffocate overnight. Historians still argue over how many died, or whether the event was exaggerated by the survivors. But the story spreads faster than truth, and in London, it becomes a rallying cry for vengeance. And vengeance has a name: Robert Clive. You find him in Madras, a wiry man with sharp eyes and a sharper will. He began as a company clerk, bored enough to duel for entertainment, reckless enough to volunteer for battle. Now he's a legend, the kind of man who believes destiny negotiates with him personally. He gathers his forces, boards ships, and sails up the coast toward Bengal, determined to reclaim what's rightfully his employers. A quirky tidbit. Clive financed part of his campaign not with official funds, but with private loans from British merchants. A war on credit, the world's first leveraged buyout, but with bayonets. You march beside his army through swamps buzzing with mosquitoes, the humidity so thick it feels like breathing through silk. Sepoys trudge barefoot, their muskets wrapped in oiled cloth to keep them dry. British officers wipe sweat from their powdered wigs and swear creatively. Every step forward feels like wading through history's glue. Slow, sticky, irreversible. Then comes Plassey, 1757. The name will become legend, but today it's just a mango grove on the banks of a sluggish river. Clive's army, about 3,000 men, most of them Indian sepoys, faces Siraj-ud-Daulah's 50,000. The odds are absurd, but empire, you realize, doesn't play fair. You crouch beneath a tree as thunder rolls overhead. The first musket shots crack through the rain. The Nawab's cannons roar, but his powder has turned to sludge in the downpour. Clive's men, better sheltered, return fire methodically. Smoke coils through the mango trees like ghostly script, and then betrayal. Always betrayal. Several of the Nawab's generals, already bribed by the company, hold back their troops. Their silence is deadlier than any cannon. By afternoon, Siraj-ud-Daulah's army collapses. He flees, only to be captured and executed days later. The battlefield steams under the sun, scattered with broken drums, torn flags, and the faint metallic scent of victory. Historians still argue whether Clive's triumph at Plassey was a feat of genius or pure luck. Some even call it a corporate coup masquerading as battle. What's certain is that this single day rewired the world. For the first time, a private company, not a nation, not a king, had conquered a country. A mainstream fact again. After Plassey, the East India Company gained the right to collect taxes, revenue, in Bengal, effectively transforming from merchant to monarch. Within a decade, the company controlled an area larger than Britain itself, and wealth beyond comprehension. You walk through the governor's palace in Calcutta, newly refurbished and suspiciously European. Chandeliers sparkle where once hung brass lamps. Indian clerks shuffle papers under portraits of British directors. Outside, the Hooghly glitters with ships. The river, now a conveyor belt for empire. A clerk hands you a report written in tidy cursive. Profits for the current fiscal year have doubled. Local unrest minimal. Native cooperation satisfactory. You glance out the window and see starving peasants dragging carts through the mud. Satisfactory indeed. A quirky tidbit. When Clive returned to London, he brought home so much treasure that British Parliament later investigated him for corruption. He defended himself calmly, saying, "By God, I stand astonished at my own moderation." The man had looted an empire and still felt underpaid. Back in Bengal, the consequences unfold quietly, like a tightening noose. The company's revenue collectors squeeze taxes from farmers who no longer understand where their money goes. British administrators replace local officials. Trade becomes tribute. You pass villages where the harvest rots while peasants starve because the grain has been requisitioned for export. Historians still argue whether this was greed or ignorance. Some say the company simply lacked the administrative structure to govern humanely. Others insist exploitation was the plan all along. Either way, Bengal's prosperity begins to dim like a candle in a draft. You visit a silk weaver's hut near Murshidabad. The air smells of dye and despair. A weaver named Haran holds up his calloused fingers, once nimble, now scarred. "They say the English pay fair," he mutters, "but fair changes every season." Behind him, half-finished bolts of silk gather dust. The company has switched to importing cheap cloth from England, strangling the very industry it once prized. The invisible hand of the market, it seems, has quite a grip. Meanwhile, in Calcutta, British officers dine on silver plates and complain about the humidity. You watch them laugh beneath a portrait of Clive, wine staining their lips red as pomegranate seeds. Empire, you realize, always eats well. A mainstream fact, again. By the 1760s, the East India Company commanded an army larger than Britain's. Its forces not only defended its trade but also fought wars, annexed territories, and collected revenue. It had become, in effect, a state within a state, a corporate sovereign. You walk outside into the humid night. The river glows with moonlight, and somewhere a sitar hums a melody that doesn't quite sound sad, just endless. A line of sepoys marches past, their bayonets catching the starlight. You can't help thinking how strange it is that so many of them still believe they're serving a commercial venture, not an empire. Historians still argue whether India was conquered by British strategy or Indian collaboration. The truth, as always, lies between, a tangle of ambition, betrayal, and misunderstanding that no musket can untangle. At dawn, you find yourself at Clive's desk. He's writing to Parliament, describing Bengal as an inexhaustible fountain of wealth. His quill scratches across the paper, leaving trails of destiny and delusion alike. The ink barely dries before the consequences begin to flow. Famine, rebellion, reform, all from this single stroke of pen and powder. You step outside as the city wakes. Calcutta's docks gleam with ships loading textiles and tea. The smell of salt, sweat, and profit hangs heavy in the air. The East India Company flag flutters above the fort, white background, red cross, and the faint echo of Elizabeth's signature from long ago. The world has changed beyond recognition, yet somehow it's still ruled by ink, gold, and very good timing. And as you watch the ships fade into the horizon, you can almost hear the next chapter whispering from the waves. What begins in Bengal will not end here. The rains have stopped and Bengal breathes again, but the air feels wrong, as if the monsoon washed away not just the dust, but the last traces of mercy. You wander through Calcutta's narrow lanes, where merchants shout in half English, half Bengali, and beggars sleep in the shadow of whitewashed mansions. The East India Company's flag flutters above Fort William, clean and confident, while the streets below sink in mud. You smell molasses, decay, and opulence, the perfume of empire at its most efficient. The company has grown unrecognizable. It governs now through signatures rather than swords, its ink sealing the fate of millions. You pass a bulletin nailed to a wooden gate. Notice of Revenue Collection Schedule. Villagers crowd around it, none able to read English, yet each understanding perfectly what it means. Another round of taxes due, another harvest surrendered. Inside the fort, the company's officials sip tea sweetened with sugar shipped from the Caribbean. A neat circle of exploitation spanning half the planet. They discuss policy with the same tone they'd use to discuss weather. The Governor General's council table gleams under a chandelier. On its polished surface, treaties are born and nations are undone. A mainstream historical fact. After the Battle of Plassey, the company obtained the Diwani, or the right to collect revenue, from the Mughal emperor in 1765. This made it the de facto ruler of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, an empire won not by parliament, but by a balance sheet. Overnight, a trading corporation became the overlord of some 30 million people. You step out to the veranda overlooking the river, where British officers gossip about profits like poets discussing love. One man grins, waving his glass. "It's remarkable," he says, "how obedient the natives become when you control their pay." Another chuckles, or their rice. You force a smile, but your stomach tightens. The company's power is no longer just military, it's economic hypnosis. And yet, the company's rule has a peculiar softness about it, or at least that's how they describe it. They call it the laissez-faire policy, the gentle hand of commerce. It sounds civilized, almost humane. You soon learn what it really means. Let the market rule, even when it ruins. A quirky tidbit. Some British officials in Bengal genuinely believed they were bringing free trade to India, unaware that freedom for them meant famine for everyone else. One of them, a man named Henry Verelst, wrote to London boasting that market forces will correct any local scarcity. Months later, scarcity corrected 1 million lives into graves. Historians still argue whether the company's economic model was deliberate exploitation or simple incompetence. Some say its officials were too naive, too far from London, too caught between greed and bureaucracy to understand the devastation they caused. Others see no naivety, only calculation. You stand between those arguments and hear both truths whispering through the rustle of dry rice stalks. You ride out of Calcutta toward the countryside. The fields stretch endlessly, gold beneath the late sun. But many lie abandoned. Farmers have been ordered to grow indigo instead of food, the blue dye fetching higher profits in London than grain ever could. The riverbanks gleam with vats of indigo, their colors sinking into the soil like bruises. A mainstream fact again. By the 1770s, large portions of Bengal's farmland were forced into cash crop production under the company's supervision. Peasants who resisted faced heavy fines or imprisonment. When monsoons failed or markets collapsed, famine followed. You pass a village where the wells have gone dry. A mother sits by the road, holding a child too quiet for its size. The silence clings to you. A British revenue officer rides past, noting figures in his ledger. To him, they're numbers. To you, they're ghosts. That famine, yes, that one, is coming. The Great Bengal Famine of 1770. A catastrophe so vast it will leave corpses stacked like logs by the Ganges. Historians still argue over the death toll, 10 million, perhaps more. Yet in London, company shareholders will still receive record dividends. You stop for the night in a traveler's inn, where an Englishman and an Indian clerk share a table. The clerk, eyes hollow, asks softly, "Why does your king need our hunger?" The Englishman smiles, embarrassed. "It's not the king," he says. "It's just business." You wish he'd stop smiling. The next morning, Calcutta's offices hum with paperwork. Complaints about famine arrive by the cartload, but the company responds with statistics. One administrator writes, "The natives are indolent. They perish because they will not work." The logic of empire always blames the victim. It's cheaper that way. A quirky tidbit. The same year millions died in Bengal, London celebrated one of its wealthiest periods. Tea, sugar, and Indian textiles flooded the markets. Aristocrats toasted with fortunes extracted from starvation. A painting by Joshua Reynolds even depicted prosperity as a goddess handing gold to Britannia. No mention of whose hands the gold came from. You drift through the governor's mansion one evening as rain hammers on the windows. A grand dinner is underway. Silver platters gleam. Laughter ripples through the hall. Between toasts, someone reads aloud a letter from London. Parliament congratulates the company on its extraordinary service to the British nation. The irony is thick enough to cut with a spoon, but cracks are forming, even here. Reports of corruption, of mismanagement, of moral rot begin to reach Westminster. Clive, now a rich man, defends himself before Parliament with that famous arrogance. He insists he's innocent, that he merely took gifts befitting my station. You'd laugh if it weren't so predictable. Historians still argue whether Clive was a villain or a visionary. To his admirers, he was a man who carved an empire from chaos. To his critics, he was the architect of systematic plunder. In truth, he was both, because empire always wears two faces, one that smiles for portraits and one that devours in silence. As you leave the dinner, the night smells faintly of jasmine and sewage. You pass the servants' quarters where Indian cooks sleep on the floor beside empty pots. One wakes, squints at you, and mutters something in Bengali, a prayer or perhaps a curse. You can't tell which. The next morning, a British officer briefs new recruits. His voice is calm, almost cheerful. "Remember, gentlemen, the company rewards efficiency. We are here not to rule, but to facilitate prosperity." You wonder whose prosperity he means. Behind him, the company flag snaps crisply in the wind, a white cross dividing a red field, like a smile with teeth. A mainstream fact again. By the late 18th century, the East India Company controlled not just trade, but politics, law, and taxation across much of India. It maintained its own courts, its own coinage, and a private army of over 100,000 men. Britain itself had become dependent on the revenue pouring from Indian provinces. You sit at the riverbank, watching fireflies drift above the water like fading embers. The empire seems eternal tonight, invincible, unchangeable. Yet somewhere, in the quiet villages stripped bare by famine, something fragile but powerful is awakening. A resentment, a remembrance, the kind of memory that doesn't die, even when its carriers do. You close your eyes. The river hums beneath you, full of silt and sorrow, carrying the reflection of stars that seem smaller than they used to. For now, the company is unstoppable, but you know that every empire, like every tide, carries the seeds of its own retreat. For now, though, the books balance, the ships sail. The ledgers sing their false hymns of prosperity, and across the water, London glows with the light of Bengal's extinguished lamps. Dawn breaks pale and silent over the muddy fields of Bengal. The smoke from last night's cooking fires still curls upward, mingling with mist and the faint odor of indigo dye. You ride slowly through the stillness, hearing only the creak of your saddle and the cough of a distant farmer. Somewhere behind you, the company's flag flaps above Fort William, its red cross the color of dried blood against the morning sky. Bengal is quiet now, but it's not peace you're hearing, it's exhaustion. The famine has burned through villages like a fever, and what remains are ghosts disguised as people. You pass rows of empty huts, doors hanging open, as if the inhabitants might return from the fields at any moment. They won't. Dogs scavenge where markets once thrived. The earth, robbed of grain, gives only silence. And yet, inside Calcutta's walls, the British still host their garden parties. Music from a harpsichord drifts out over the river as ships load up crates of silk and tea. The company's accountants call the famine an unfortunate downturn. Profit margins remain healthy. Somewhere in London, shareholders smile, unaware or unwilling to know that their dividends are minted from hunger. A mainstream historical fact. After the Bengal famine of 1770, the company's revenue barely dipped. Tax demands were simply reimposed on survivors, ensuring that losses fell on the peasants, not the boardroom. Parliament's first murmurs of concern led to the Regulating Act of 1773, Britain's awkward attempt to supervise a corporation that had become too powerful to leash. You attend one of the first council meetings after the act passes. The new Governor-General, Warren Hastings, presides with measured calm. He speaks of reforms and ethical governance, though everyone in the room knows what that really means, making the machinery of empire run more smoothly. We must act, Hastings declares, with both firmness and fairness. You note that firmness always seems to come first. A quirky tidbit. Hastings studied Persian poetry in his spare time. He adored Indian culture, even wrote letters in Urdu, but his admiration never once interfered with his administration. Loving a civilization, it turns out, doesn't stop you from profiting off it. Outside, sepoys drill in perfect lines beneath the noonday sun. Their muskets gleam, their red turbans bright against the dust. Orders are barked in English, repeated in Hindustani. The rhythm is hypnotic, discipline turned into choreography. You realize that these are no longer mercenaries for hire. They are the backbone of a private nation. Historians still argue whether Hastings' reforms were benevolent or brutal. Some credit him for stabilizing the company's chaotic rule. Others see his tenure as the moment British bureaucracy fully fused with Indian subjugation. Either way, the experiment works. Revenues rise, rebellions quiet, and London grows fat on the illusion of order. You travel north toward Bihar, where rumors whisper of rebellion. Villagers refuse to pay rent, angry at corrupt collectors. Hastings' men respond swiftly. The offenders are chained and paraded through the market. Their crops are seized. Example made. The company doesn't waste bullets when fear is cheaper. At night, you stop in Patna. The city sleeps uneasily. British officers occupy mansions once owned by Mughal governors, their walls lined with imported portraits of fox hunts and rainy English fields. You walk through one such house, listening to laughter echo down the corridors. They are playing cards in the next room, bets in pounds sterling, gossip in Hindustani slang. Empire breeds strange dialects. A mainstream fact again. Under Hastings, the company began codifying Anglo-Indian law, fusing British legal principles with selectively interpreted Hindu and Islamic texts. It sounded noble, respecting native traditions, but in practice, it reduced India's intricate legal customs to whatever served the company's convenience. In Calcutta, the Supreme Court is newly built, its white columns gleaming like a promise. British judges in powdered wigs deliver verdicts on land disputes they barely understand. One Indian merchant bows deeply before them, his fortune and freedom depending on translators. Justice now wears a foreign accent. You slip out to the veranda and look toward the Hooghly River, where barges glide silently under the moon. On their decks lie crates of opium bound for China, a new venture. The company's traders have found another market to conquer, another addiction to monetize. It's not contraband, one officer jokes. It's commerce with benefits. You almost laugh, but your throat tightens. A quirky tidbit. The East India Company's opium monopoly would later spark 2 wars with China. The British Empire was, quite literally, funded by drug trafficking at scale. If capitalism had a scent, it would reek of poppy sap. Historians still argue whether Hastings personally approved the moral decay of the company or merely inherited it. His letters suggest a man torn between conscience and career, a man who saw the ugliness yet refused to look away long enough to stop it. In one line he writes, "We have subdued a people more numerous than the whole nation of Britain." He doesn't sound proud. He sounds tired. But the board in London isn't tired. They demand more. More taxes, more revenue, more compliance. Their instructions arrive sealed with wax, polite and precise. Expand trade, secure stability, maintain dividends. That's the holy trinity of empire. Everything else, faith, culture, famine, is a footnote. You drift now toward the south again, toward Madras, where talk of expansion quickens. The Marathas are restive, the French are back in play. The company tightens its grip, spending fortunes on soldiers and spies. The line between defense and domination is gone. We don't seek conquest, an officer tells you, sharpening his saber. We merely respond to aggression. Every empire in history has said the same thing before marching, a mainstream fact. Between 1775 and 1785, the company fought the First and Second Anglo-Maratha Wars and the wars against Mysore under Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan. Each campaign drained treasure, lives, and morality, but every defeat became pretext for the next annexation. You find yourself in the thick forests of Mysore, where rain drips from banyan leaves onto British tents. The soldiers curse the leeches, the humidity, the endless ambushes. Hyder Ali's guerrilla tactics baffle them. The devil fights from the trees, one mutters. You want to correct him. It's not the devil, just a man defending his home. Tipu Sultan, Hyder's son, takes up the mantle. Fierce, intelligent, obsessed with innovation. He builds rockets that streak through the sky, terrifying British lines. A quirky detail. Tipu's engineers created iron-cased rockets decades before Europe perfected them. When the British finally captured some, they reverse-engineered the design. The next time you see fireworks in London, remember, they were born in resistance. Historians still argue whether Tipu was a tyrant or a hero. To his people, he was the tiger of Mysore, roaring against the invaders. To the company, he was an obstacle to trade. In 1799, that obstacle would be removed permanently. But for now, his flag still flies, striped and defiant. You stand on a hill overlooking the battlefield after one of those brutal clashes. Smoke curls upward, the air thick with gunpowder and rain. British soldiers collect spoils from the fallen, rings, coins, a tiger-emblazoned sword. The smell of wet metal and blood fills your nose. You realize something simple, something awful. The British no longer fight for India's riches. They fight to keep their own illusion alive, that this was ever about trade. Back in Calcutta, Hastings faces impeachment in Parliament. Accusations of corruption, cruelty, and tyranny flood Westminster. The great orator Edmund Burke calls him the destroyer of nations. The trial will drag on for 7 years and end in acquittal, but its shadow will linger. The moral debate over empire has finally begun, but it's happening an ocean away from those who live beneath its weight. You sit by the river once more, watching lanterns drift downstream, their flames flickering like dying stars. The night smells of silt and opium. Somewhere, a British officer hums a tune about home. You wonder what home even means when your wealth comes from other people's hunger. And yet, the machine keeps moving. Efficient, relentless, self-justified. The East India Company is no longer just a company, it's a habit. A habit Britain cannot quit, and India cannot yet escape. The year is 1763, though dates blur here like ink in rain. The 7 Years' War has ended in Europe, and Britain has emerged triumphant. Across the world, French banners have been lowered, treaties have been signed, and the word empire has begun to taste distinctly British. You stand on the coast of India, where the monsoon wind still carries the smell of powder and salt. The Treaty of Paris is freshly inked, but the ink hides a quiet truth. The British East India Company now stands unchallenged. A mainstream historical fact. By the Treaty of Paris, France regained some of its Indian trading posts, Pondicherry, Chandernagore, Mahe, and Karaikal, but with strict limitations. They could trade, but not fortify. Speak, but not shout. In short, they were allowed to exist, but not to matter. The French dream of an Indian empire had been buried beneath the mango groves of Plassey, and its ghost would linger only as a polite accent in the company's halls. You walk through Pondicherry's streets, where the French tricolor still flutters lazily above pastel villas. The town smells of baguettes and betel nut, an odd perfume of resignation. Children chase each other between crumbling colonial walls, unaware they're playing in a museum. French officers sip coffee under tamarind trees and mutter about what might have been. They blame the weather, the logistics, the fickleness of their Indian allies. They never blame the company. A quirky tidbit: when British soldiers occupied Pondicherry, they were amused to find entire warehouses filled with wigs and perfume. One officer wrote home joking that the French waged war more delicately than they dined. Yet when the French were gone, those same soldiers stayed behind to trade. Because even empires, it turns out, share a taste for silk. The company, flush with victory, turns its gaze inland. Bengal, Madras, and Bombay are theirs in practice, if not yet in name. The directors in London send congratulatory letters sealed with wax and smugness. They speak of commercial prosperity and stability, though both are euphemisms for control. The profits pour in. Hundreds of ships loaded with Indian cotton, indigo, and saltpeter. The stock of the company soars. Even King George himself holds shares. You attend a dinner in Calcutta celebrating the victory. The room glows with candlelight reflected in crystal glasses. British officers clink goblets of claret, their laughter echoing off marble walls. The governor rises to give a toast. To commerce, our civilizing mission. You nearly choke on the irony. Civilizing mission? Tell that to the farmers forced to grow indigo instead of rice. But no one interrupts a toast when profits are involved. Outside the mansion, the city stretches in two worlds. On one side, whitewashed bungalows with verandas and servants. On the other, dark alleys where Indian laborers sleep on mats. You step through both, hearing two languages, two realities, and one empire humming beneath them. Historians still argue whether British dominance after 1763 was inevitable or accidental. Some call it the accidental empire, a chain of business decisions that somehow became conquest. Others see deliberate expansion cloaked in trade. You suspect it's both, greed wrapped in paperwork, conquest hidden in contracts. In Madras, another kind of battle begins, a financial one. The company's wars have cost a fortune, and its directors demand repayment from India itself. Taxes rise, loans multiply, and corruption blossoms like mold in damp air. You can hear it in the tone of the clerks tallying their accounts, that blend of exhaustion and quiet guilt that money never quite erases. A mainstream fact again. By the late 1760s, the company's finances were a paradox. It was rich in territory but drowning in debt, spending more on soldiers and administration than it earned from trade. London's newspapers began to ask uncomfortable questions. Why should a private company rule millions in the name of profit? The question would haunt Parliament for decades. You walk into a council room where British officials argue over maps. The air smells of ink and self-importance. A young officer suggests expanding north into Oud. Another proposes assisting local rulers in exchange for tribute. The governor nods approvingly. Commerce, he says, requires protection. Protection, of course, always arrives with bayonets. A quirky tidbit: to maintain their image, the company issued coins bearing the Mughal emperor's name long after his authority had vanished. Indians used currency stamped with a ruler who no longer ruled, issued by merchants who pretended not to govern. It's the sort of irony that might make you laugh if it weren't so precise. The French, meanwhile, try to rebuild. In Pondicherry, they reopen schools, churches, and trading houses. They speak of friendship and neutrality, but even they know the game is over. The company's navy prowls the coastline, its cannons polished, its sailors singing in English. The Indian Ocean has chosen its master, and it speaks with a British accent now. Historians still argue about whether the French could have changed India's fate had they won at Plassey or Wandiwash. Maybe they would have exploited differently, or perhaps the same. Empires may differ in flavor, but the aftertaste is always the same: salt and sorrow. You travel inland to Bengal again. The once glorious city of Murshidabad lies quiet, its marble palaces now housing British offices. The Nawab's descendants sit in their gardens, sipping tea served by servants who bow to English masters. The sound of Persian poetry has been replaced by the scratch of quills and the rustle of paper. You find it oddly fitting: poetry conquered by bureaucracy. A mainstream fact, again. In 1765, the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II formally granted the company the right to collect revenue in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, the Diwani. Though symbolic, it legitimized British rule and marked the final transformation of the company from merchant to monarch. The emperor received an annual tribute, but it was like paying a ghost to bless a robbery. You walk through Fort William as new recruits arrive from London. Their faces are pale, their uniforms crisp, their eyes bright with dreams of adventure. Within weeks, the heat will melt those dreams into delirium. But for now, they march proudly past, each step another note in the empire's drumbeat. A quirky aside: British soldiers stationed in India often suffered from what they called Calcutta liver, a mix of malaria, heat stroke, and homesickness cured only by gin. Lots of gin. The joke went that a British officer could drink more than he could govern, and both feats were impressive. You wander out to the docks. The ships rock gently, loaded with crates stamped EIC. Inside, spices, silk, and sometimes the odd elephant tusk. Everything that glitters in London's markets began its journey here. The sailors whistle as they load, their voices blending with gulls and waves. For them, India is just another stop before payday. For everyone else, it's the world. Historians still argue whether the British victory over France marked the birth of modern imperialism or merely the evolution of older greed. But as you stand there, watching the sails fill with wind, you realize how fragile it all looks. One storm, one mutiny, one miscalculation, and the whole edifice could crumble. Yet for now, it stands. The sun dips low, painting the river orange. A British officer nearby adjusts his hat and says quietly, "We've done it. We've secured the future." You want to tell him the future never stays secured, but he's already walking away, his boots crunching on the dock. Behind him, the French flag still flutters faintly over Pondicherry, more memory than menace. The British don't even bother to tear it down. They know that sometimes power is best displayed through indifference. You turn toward the horizon, where the last of the sunlight glows on the water like molten gold. The empire hums, its gears grinding quietly beneath the surface. Commerce, conquest, civilization, all masquerading as progress. The British may have won the war, but India is far from done with them. The tide recedes, leaving the sand imprinted with boot marks and barefoot prints side by side. For now, they look like equals, but you know how quickly the sea washes one away and leaves the other behind. The air smells of dust and horses again. You stand beside a dirt road winding toward a battlefield somewhere in the Indian heartland. The year has shuffled forward to the 1790s, and the East India Company's red-coated soldiers march past like a river of iron. Their boots kick up clouds that hang over the road like ghosts refusing to leave. Each man carries a musket, a pack, and a look that says he's fighting for pay, not patriotism. The company's army isn't an army of empire. It's an army of accountants with bayonets. Ahead of them rides a man whose name will echo far beyond this field. Arthur Wellesley. He's young now, thin, ambitious, his gaze sharp enough to cut the horizon in half. You'll know him later as the Duke of Wellington, the man who will defeat Napoleon. But tonight, he's just another officer trying to prove himself under the Indian sun. His brother, Richard Wellesley, governs as the company's newest mastermind, half administrator, half imperial dreamer. Together, the Wellesleys are about to turn the company's holdings into something Britain can finally call its own, a mainstream historical fact. Between 1798 and 1805, Governor-General Richard Wellesley launched a series of military campaigns against Indian powers, the Marathas, Mysore, and the remnants of Tipu Sultan's kingdom. These wars doubled the company's territory and set the foundation for direct British dominance across India. What began as protection of trade had quietly evolved into an organized conquest. You walk along the outskirts of one of those campaigns. The jungle hums with cicadas. The smell of sweat and gunpowder clings to everything. Sepoys march beside British regulars, their brown and red coats merging into one long bruise of humanity. Behind them rumble cannons pulled by oxen, wheels squealing like angry spirits. You can hear distant drumming, Maratha warbands preparing to defend what remains of their realm. The air is electric with inevitability. Historians still argue whether these campaigns were defensive measures or thinly disguised imperial aggression. The British insisted they were merely restoring order. But you've seen enough order restored to know that every empire defines peace as the moment only its flag remains standing. You follow Arthur Wellesley's column as it pushes towards Seringapatam, Tipu Sultan's fortress city in Mysore. The air grows heavier with every mile. The tropical sun glares like a judge. Inside the fort, Tipu prepares for his final stand. His banners blaze with the image of a tiger devouring a British soldier, a not-so-subtle prophecy of resistance. A quirky tidbit. Tipu's obsession with tigers went far beyond symbolism. He owned a mechanical automaton, a life-sized wooden tiger mauling a red-coated soldier. When wound up, it growled, and the soldier's arm flailed helplessly. The device was later seized and sent to London, where curious aristocrats gawked at it between courses of venison. You wonder who the real savage was, the maker or the spectator. The siege of Seringapatam begins before dawn. You crouch among the British batteries as mortars thump and the sky bursts open with fire. Smoke rolls across the battlefield, turning the rising sun into a sickle of red light. Wellesley's men scale the ramparts under musket fire, shouting, slipping on blood-slick stones. When they breach the walls, Tipu's defenders fight to the last. The tiger dies at his post, surrounded by his guards, bullets tearing through silk and steel alike. By nightfall, Mysore falls silent. The British loot the palace, carrying away jeweled swords, elephant tusks, and silk banners as trophies. Somewhere in the rubble, a small, brass plaque is nailed to a door. Property of the East India Company. The transformation is complete. A mainstream fact again. Tipu Sultan's death in 1799 marked the end of major organized Indian resistance in southern India. The Wellesleys' victories made the company's rule effectively unchallenged in the subcontinent, with only scattered regions still outside its grasp. You watch Arthur Wellesley walk through the captured city. His boots crunch on broken tiles, his face expressionless. He pauses beside Tipu's fallen banner and murmurs something you can't quite catch. Later, when reporters in London ask him about the battle, He'll describe it as a fine piece of work. Empires, you note, always prefer understatement. Historians still argue whether the Wellesley brothers' actions were acts of brilliance or arrogance. Arthur would become a national hero, his career immortalized in marble. Richard would face censure for overspending company funds. Yet both would leave behind an empire larger than anything Elizabeth's merchants had dared imagine. In Madras, you stand at the docks watching new ships arrive. Some carry troops, others bring administrators, engineers, and missionaries. The next wave of empire. The soldiers conquer, the bureaucrats organize, the priests justify. Each group believes it serves a higher cause. Each is wrong. You sit in a tavern later that evening as the officers celebrate their victory. They drink punch mixed with lime and rum, singing loudly about home. One raises a toast, "To the tigers fall and Britons rise." Laughter follows, and you catch yourself wondering if the joke will sound as proud a century later. A quirky aside, the captured mechanical tiger from Tipu's palace was displayed in the East India Company's London Museum for decades. Children would line up to turn its crank, giggling as it growled. Generations learned to see empire as entertainment, but not all is well in paradise. The wars have drained the company's coffers again. Debt mounts, administrators squabble. Richard Wellesley's vision of expansion is costly, and London grows nervous. The company that once bought kings is now begging Parliament for loans. You can almost hear the smugness in the politicians' voices. The servant has become too powerful. Time to remind it who owns whom. A mainstream fact again. In 1813, the renewal of the company's charter formally ended its monopoly on trade with India. Private British merchants were now free to operate under the Crown's supervision. The company remained the governing power, but its commercial soul was fading. It had become what it once despised, a bureaucracy. You travel north with Wellesley's troops, where they face the Marathas in a series of battles across the dusty plains. The fighting is fierce but brief. The Maratha Confederacy fractures, just as it had in earlier decades. By the turn of the century, their capital, Pune, lies under British control. The map of India has turned red, not from blood this time, but from ink. Historians still argue whether Britain's rise was due to superior strategy or simply timing, arriving at the moment when India's great empires had already weakened themselves. Some even call it the conquest of exhaustion. You look across the landscape, forts in ruins, palaces converted into offices, kings signing treaties they can't read. And you think exhaustion sounds about right. A quirky detail. After every victory, the British built roads not just for soldiers, but for paperwork. From Madras to Bombay to Calcutta, dusty highways became conduits for tax records, trade receipts, and census counts. The empire's veins carried not blood, but ink. By 1805, Arthur Wellesley sails home, his boots still dusty from Indian soil. He'll later call India a great school for command, which is an elegant way to describe a decade of learning how to rule by coercion. When he defeats Napoleon at Waterloo, he'll use many of the same tactics he perfected here: discipline, patience, and relentless logistics. You wonder if the ghosts of Seringapatam followed him there. In the quiet that follows, you ride through the Indian countryside once more. The forts stand silent, their cannons rusting, their banners gone. Villagers plant crops in fields that once ran red. Life, stubborn and cyclical, pushes through empire's footprints. Children splash in irrigation canals built by company engineers, unaware they were meant to serve control, not comfort. You stop by a banyan tree near a road newly paved by the British. Beneath it, a group of Indian clerks read out tax lists to farmers, recording payments in ledgers stamped with the East India Company's seal. The farmers nod, hand over coins, and walk away without a word. The machine hums on, indifferent, efficient. The sun sinks low. Somewhere, a bugle sounds from a garrison. Somewhere else, a temple bell answers. Two empires share the same twilight, neither realizing how temporary they both are. And as the light fades, you remember the sound of Tipu's tiger, the mechanical growl, the wooden soldier's cry. The British silenced it, but you can still hear it faintly in the distance, echoing through the centuries like unfinished business. The air in Bengal has changed again. Less wild, more deliberate. The thunder of cannons has quieted into the scratch of quills. Armies still march, but the louder footsteps now belong to clerks. By the early 1800s, the East India Company no longer wins battles with muskets alone. It wins them with minutes, memos, and meticulous records. The conquest is no longer of land, but of meaning. Every border is redrawn, every custom measured, taxed, and catalogued. You're walking through the birth of a new kind of empire, one built not of flags, but of files. Calcutta has become the capital of this invisible machinery. You move through streets lined with white colonnades and broad avenues that look suspiciously European. British carriages clatter past bullock carts, both heading toward the same horizon, but never the same destination. A humid wind blows off the river, carrying the scent of coal smoke and fried lentils, the aroma of two worlds refusing to blend. Inside Fort William, the council gathers. The Governor-General, now a position recognized by Parliament, presides over a table cluttered with scrolls, ledgers, and teacups. They're discussing reforms, which in British vocabulary usually means new rules that make their own power feel righteous. The topic today, land revenue. The idea is to fix tax rates permanently so that both company and farmer know exactly who owns what. It sounds simple, even noble. It will, of course, ruin lives. A mainstream historical fact. In 1793, Lord Cornwallis introduced the Permanent Settlement Act, locking Bengal's taxes at a fixed rate forever. The plan was meant to encourage stability. Instead, it turned Indian landlords into intermediaries and forced peasants into debt. When crops failed or markets shifted, taxes did not. The result was predictable. Famine returned as reliably as monsoon rain. You stroll through a village outside Calcutta. The fields shimmer in the sun, but the farmers' eyes are dull. They know the figures better than any accountant. "We owe what we cannot grow," one man says, holding a handful of parched rice. Behind him, a British revenue officer adjusts his hat and notes something in a leather-bound book. Numbers, after all, don't die of hunger. A quirky tidbit. Some British officials genuinely believed Indians were bad farmers because they preferred conversation to cultivation. One even suggested they'd work harder if taxed more, a theory as logical as treating fever with fire. The empire, you notice, excels at blaming its victims elegantly. Historians still argue whether Cornwallis's reform was misguided idealism or deliberate exploitation. Some praise its efficiency, the birth of modern property law, they call it. Others see it for what it was, the monetization of survival. You lean toward the latter, mostly because efficiency is just cruelty with better handwriting. Calcutta, meanwhile, hums with contradictions. Theaters perform Shakespeare while street vendors sell mangoes beneath their balconies. Newspapers print reports about European philosophy beside advertisements for indigo auctions. The company is trying to build a little London on the banks of the Hooghly, but the soil keeps reminding them it's Bengal. A mainstream fact again. By the 1820s, British reformers in India began pushing for the civilizing mission. They claimed to uplift Indian society through education, law, and religion, ideas that mixed moral zeal with imperial arrogance. Lord William Bentinck, Governor-General in the 1830s, outlawed sati, the burning of widows, a reform praised in London and resented in India. Morality, like trade, had become a commodity. You attend one of Bentinck's dinners in Calcutta. The table groans under silver platters, the conversation under self-importance. "We must teach them English," one missionary insists. "That's how civilization begins." Across from him, a Bengali scholar quietly replies, "And ends?" The laughter that follows isn't kind. Outside the mansion, the first Indian newspapers circulate in English and Bengali alike. The editors, often educated by British schools, use the colonizers' language to criticize the colonizers' rule. You hold one such paper, its ink still damp. Bengal Gazette. The lead editorial calls for justice, not gifts, liberty, not lessons. You smile. The British have taught grammar well enough for rebellion. A quirky detail. Thomas Macaulay, the British historian and politician, wrote in 1835 that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India. Ironically, his essay would inspire generations of Indian reformers to master that very library and eventually dismantle the empire it justified. Words, you realize, are dangerous cargo. Historians still argue whether the British reforms were genuinely progressive or just strategic. Abolishing sati, banning child sacrifice, establishing Western education, all noble on paper, all applied unevenly, all accompanied by higher taxes. Empire always finds a way to turn virtue into a revenue stream. You wander now through a printing press near College Street. Bengali apprentices feed paper into machines as British foremen supervise. The press is noisy, sweaty, glorious. Pages pour out describing revolts in the Punjab, new taxes in Bihar, and poetry that dares to dream of freedom. You pick up a leaflet quoting a young reformer named Raja Ram Mohan Roy. Liberty is the first condition of virtue. His handwriting trembles with both caution and conviction. You tuck it in your pocket, knowing it will matter someday. Calcutta itself feels restless. The British live in airy villas in Chowringhee, the Indians in cramped alleys behind the bazaar. Between them lies the Maidan, a wide green space where polo ponies gallop and soldiers drill, Empire's playground. You walk its edges at sunset, the sky turns molten, the grass smells of rain, and for a moment, everything feels suspended. You can almost believe in the illusion of permanence the British have built. Marble columns, manicured lawns, printed laws. But you've seen enough history to know illusions have expiration dates. A mainstream fact again. By the 1830s, Indian resentment toward British rule was mounting. Economic exploitation, racial arrogance, and legal inequality turned admiration into anger. Educated Indians began forming political societies. Soldiers murmured discontent in their barracks. The fuse was being laid, quietly, inch by inch. You pass a British officer instructing sepoys in the use of new infield rifles. The men obey, their faces expressionless. You know what's coming. The cartridges greased with animal fat, the rumors that will ignite mutiny across the land. But for now, it's just another drill beneath a crimson sunset. Historians still argue whether the coming rebellion was inevitable or accidental. Was it sparked by faith, by hunger, by pride, or by sheer exhaustion? The truth is simpler. You can only rule by consent for so long before consent becomes fiction. A quirky aside. Many company officials recorded dreams of India's loyal and grateful subjects. Some even published books titled The Moral Duty of the Native. You wonder what those same men thought when, just decades later, those natives turned their guns on them. Night descends on Calcutta. The gas lamps flicker, and somewhere a steam engine whistles. The Industrial Revolution has reached the tropics. British engineers lay railways that slice through jungles and villages alike. Telegraph wires hum with invisible electricity, connecting London to Lucknow in hours. The empire now runs on current as much as coin. You watch sparks leap from a telegraph pole and vanish into the dark. They look like fireflies, tiny, fleeting, beautiful. For a moment, you wonder if progress and exploitation are just two words for the same miracle. Then you remember the famine fields and know the answer. The night wind carries the smell of rain and ink, of progress and loss. Calcutta sleeps uneasily, its heartbeat the steady tick of the company's clock. The clerks will rise at dawn, the soldiers will drill, and the ledgers will balance again. But under that mechanical rhythm, something human still stirs, restless, remembering, waiting. And you, standing at the river's edge, can almost hear it, a low murmur rising from millions of throats. Not yet rebellion, not yet freedom, just the sound of a nation breathing under the weight of another's dream. The year is 1857, and India holds its breath. You feel it before you hear it, the tension in the air, like a bowstring drawn too tight. The monsoon clouds gather above dusty cantonments and parched fields alike. The British call it a season of unrest. You can call it what it is, the moment the ground begins to remember its strength. You stand near Meerut, north of Delhi, where rows of sepoys, Indian soldiers in British service, drill beneath a punishing sun. Their red coats hang heavy with sweat. For months, rumors have traveled faster than any messenger could carry them. The new Enfield rifle cartridges are greased with cow and pig fat. To use them, the sepoy must bite the paper casing, an act that insults both Hindu and Muslim faith alike. The company dismisses the claims as superstition. The soldiers don't. A mainstream historical fact. On May 10, 1857, Indian sepoys in Meerut mutinied against their British officers, freeing imprisoned comrades and marching toward Delhi. What began as a military protest spread like wildfire into the largest anti-colonial uprising in 19th century Asia, the Indian Rebellion, or as the British would later call it, the Sepoy Mutiny. You can almost hear it, hooves pounding the dirt, drums echoing between barracks, the sharp crack of muskets fired not at an enemy, but at masters. Within days, the rebellion surges across northern India. Cities ignite: Delhi, Kanpur, Lucknow, Jhansi. The company's officials scramble to secure their walls and write panicked letters to Calcutta. Send reinforcements, send anything. Historians still argue whether the revolt was spontaneous or inevitable. Some say it was an accident of circumstance, others that it was centuries of resentment finally given a spark. You know better. History doesn't explode by accident. It builds pressure, quietly, relentlessly, until silence itself becomes unbearable. In Delhi, the old Mughal capital, the rebels proclaim Bahadur Shah II, the last descendant of the great emperors, as their figurehead. The city's streets fill with chants of Zindabad, long live. For a brief, trembling moment, it feels as though time has reversed, that India has reclaimed its own heartbeat. You stand by the crumbling red fort as flags of green and saffron flutter again above its towers. The emperor, frail and bewildered, is led to his throne. His courtiers whisper, "The British are finished." But the British are never finished. In Calcutta, the company's council erupts into furious motion. Telegrams crackle with orders. Steamships ferry regiments up the Ganges, and newspapers in London scream for vengeance. The rebellion, they insist, is savagery, treachery, madness. The company's directors, terrified for their fortunes, send word to the crown: assist us or lose India forever. A quirky tidbit: the British press at the time printed lurid tales of atrocities, many exaggerated or invented to stir outrage. "Babies bayoneted, women butchered," one headline screamed. The reports fueled Parliament's decision to intervene directly. In empire, horror always doubles as marketing. You travel north again through scorched countryside. Villages are abandoned, fields charred. Both sides commit horrors too great to fit into ledgers. At Kanpur, British civilians are massacred by rebels. At Delhi, entire neighborhoods are flattened in retaliation. The land becomes a graveyard for certainty. Every ideology buried in the same ash. A mainstream fact again, the British suppression of the rebellion was brutal beyond measure. Tens of thousands were executed, entire towns burned, and captured rebels tied to cannon mouths and blown apart in public. Officially, it was called justice. In truth, it was theater, a spectacle of dominance meant to cauterize defiance. You walk through Lucknow's residency after its siege, walls riddled with bullet holes. British officers lounge on broken furniture, smoking as if the corpses outside were mere scenery. India must learn obedience again, one mutters. You don't answer. You've learned that empire doesn't want obedience. It wants exhaustion. In Jhansi, far to the south, a woman mounts a horse in armor that gleams like sunrise. Rani Lakshmibai, Queen of Jhansi, rides into battle with her infant son strapped to her back. Her sword flashes, her voice cuts through smoke. Main apni Jhansi nahi dungi, I will not give up my Jhansi. Her defiance becomes legend, her fall inevitable. When she dies, the British call her the Jezebel of India. Indians call her immortal. A quirky detail. After the Rani's death, British soldiers looted her palace and found her English grammar books. She had been learning the language of her conquerors even as she fought them. You can't decide whether that's tragic or perfect. Historians still argue whether the rebellion was a war for independence or simply a desperate reaction. Some claim it lacked unity, Hindus and Muslims fighting for different visions of freedom. Others call it India's first Great Awakening. Either way, it changes everything. The East India Company's mask of legitimacy is shattered beyond repair. By 1858, the rebellion lies crushed. The Red Fort is silent again, its courtyards slick with monsoon rain and memory. Bahadur Shah II, the last Mughal, is exiled to Rangoon, where he will die a poet without a throne. The British parade his trial as proof of victory. The rebels' execution grounds as proof of order restored. The company congratulates itself, but London has made up its mind. A mainstream fact. Later that same year, Parliament passed the Government of India Act, dissolving the East India Company and transferring all its territories to the British Crown. Queen Victoria would now rule in trust for the people of India. The era of corporate empire was over. The Raj had begun. You stand in Calcutta's council chamber one final time. The company's flag is lowered. A British officer, reading from a scroll, declares, "All powers, territories, and possessions heretofore vested in the East India Company are hereby transferred to Her Majesty." The words echo like a requiem. Outside, clerks watch in silence, some weeping, some relieved, all uncertain. The empire hasn't ended, it's merely changed uniforms. A quirky aside, Queen Victoria's 1858 proclamation promised her new subjects equal justice and protection of rights. It was translated into dozens of Indian languages and recited in markets and temples. For many Indians, it sounded like mercy. For most, it sounded like fiction. Historians still argue whether the Crown's takeover softened or hardened British rule. In practice, it did both. The bureaucratic violence became more polite, more procedural, less impulsive, but no less lethal. The Raj would master what the company invented, domination disguised as administration. You walk through Delhi again, years later. The city smells of rebuilding and regret. British architects lay out wide boulevards, demolishing what they call native clutter. Soldiers guard every gate, yet beneath the quiet, you feel something strange, a persistence. The rebellion failed, but its echo lingers. Street songs whisper of Rani Lakshmibai, of sepoys who refused to kneel, of poets exiled for rhymes that rhymed too close to truth. The company's name still appears carved above warehouses and stamped on coins. Merchants keep using it out of habit. Rebellion doesn't erase bureaucracy overnight, but its soul is gone, replaced by bureaucracy with a crown. You stare at one of those coins. East India Company, 1857, and realize it's the last of its kind, a relic minted on the eve of its own extinction. The new British administration wastes no time rebuilding control. Railroads expand deeper inland, post offices multiply, and telegraph wires stretch like veins of copper through the empire. London calls it modernization. Indians call it surveillance. You see farmers gaping at the first locomotive roaring across the plains, half wonder, half fear. The train's whistle sounds like triumph, but also like a warning. A mainstream fact again. In the aftermath of the rebellion, the British reorganized their army, ensuring that Indian soldiers were divided by region, religion, and caste, never again to unite as they had in 1857. Divide and rule was not an invention, but now it became official policy. At night, you sit beside the Yamuna River, watching its surface shimmer under a sliver of moonlight. Fireflies drift above the water, fragile, luminous, ungovernable. In the distance, the Red Fort looms, part ruin, part museum, its halls echoing with footsteps that don't belong. You breathe in the warm night air and listen to the sounds of Delhi rebuilding itself from memory. The clang of hammers, the murmur of prayers, the faint music of defiance. History, it seems, never ends. It only changes narrators. For now, the company is dead, but the idea it birthed, profit wrapped in purpose, empire justified by efficiency, still marches on, neatly dressed, impeccably polite, and infinitely patient. The age of kings has returned, but the merchant's ghost still sits at the table, quietly counting. The banners have changed, but the logic hasn't. You walk through the heat-hazed plains of northern India in the 1860s, a few years after the company's funeral. Now it is the British Raj that rules, not by contract, but by creed. Where ledgers once dictated policy, Parliament now does, though often with the same handwriting. The difference lies mostly in stationery and ceremony. Calcutta still serves as the capital, but its air feels heavier, filled with uniforms instead of wigs, officials instead of merchants. The East India Company's warehouses have been repainted. The words, Her Majesty's Service, now crown the entrances where EIC once stood. The same clerks copy the same ledgers at the same desks, only the seal on the wax has changed. You notice that continuity is the empire's favorite disguise, a mainstream historical fact. The British Raj officially began in 1858 and lasted until 1947. Its administrators claimed to bring good government, emphasizing law, education, and infrastructure, while maintaining the hierarchy of race and class that kept power British and obedience Indian. You wander through a courtroom in Calcutta, its high ceilings echoing with English legalese. British judges in black robes preside over Indian defendants who stand barefoot before them. The translators stumble over words like equity and justice because they have no easy equivalent in Bengali or Hindi. Outside, a beggar sleeps beneath a marble plaque that reads, "The rule of law is the blessing of civilization." Historians still argue whether British law brought fairness or fossilization. It codified rights, but froze privilege, creating a society obsessed with paperwork but allergic to equality. You can almost hear the shuffle of petitions like a new kind of prayer. A quirky tidbit, some British officers were so convinced of their civilizing mission that they carried pocket Bibles and cricket bats wherever they went. One colonel reportedly taught village children to bowl before he taught them to read. His superiors praised the effort as sound pedagogy. You wonder if anyone ever asked the children which lesson they preferred. The 1860s and 1870s become decades of improvement. Railways expand from Calcutta to Delhi to Bombay. Iron veins stitching the subcontinent together. Telegraph lines stretch overhead like spider silk, buzzing with orders from London that cross oceans in minutes. The British call this progress. Indians call it convenience for their rulers. A mainstream fact again. By 1880, India had over 9,000 miles of railway track, most built to move troops quickly and export raw materials efficiently. It was a masterpiece of engineering and exploitation intertwined. You ride one of these trains through the plains. The whistle shrieks, the wheels scream, and the world rushes backward. In your compartment, British officers sip gin while Indian laborers cling to the open doors. The rhythm of the rails is hypnotic, steady, relentless, indifferent. Progress sounds a lot like repetition. The countryside outside the window blurs. Green rice fields, brick kilns, banyan trees, and occasional flashes of poverty so sharp they cut the eye. You pass villages where British land laws have turned peasants into tenants and tenants into debtors. A moneylender squats beneath a tree, ledger open, pen poised like a weapon. The numbers march down the page with military precision. Historians still argue whether British economic policy developed India or drained it. Some praise the railways and irrigation canals. Others point to the recurring famines that followed in their wake. The truth, as always, is not balanced. It's layered. Development for some meant disaster for many. A quirky detail. In London, fashionable dinner guests referred to India as the jewel in the crown. They wore Indian silk, Indian diamonds, and Indian gilt with equal elegance. Meanwhile, in India's Deccan Plateau, fields lay cracked and bare. You arrive in Bombay, modern, noisy, brimming with contradictions. British-built stone buildings rise beside coconut groves. Horse-drawn trams jingle through markets that smell of fish and incense. The city pulses with new energy. Indian merchants trade cotton and opium. Parsi industrialists build factories, and a few Indian lawyers begin to argue British law in fluent English. Empire, you realize, always teaches its subjects the tools of their own undoing. A mainstream fact, again, the late 19th century saw the rise of a Western-educated Indian middle class, lawyers, journalists, and reformers. They adopted the British language and political ideas but aimed them back at the empire itself. Figures like Dadabhai Naoroji, the grand old man of India, argued that Britain was bleeding India dry through economic drain. His phrase would later become a slogan for independence. You attend a meeting of one of these new associations in a smoky Bombay hall. The men wear suits instead of turbans, speak of representation and rights, and quote John Stuart Mill as if he were scripture. They still address the British as our honorable rulers, but the deference sounds thinner each year. You can feel something shifting, subtle, yet unstoppable. An awakening that doesn't need rifles, only reason. Historians still debate whether British education created loyal subjects or accidental revolutionaries. Lord Macaulay, who once declared India had no history, would have been horrified to see his English syllabi turn into the grammar of dissent. Every essay, every petition, every speech becomes a small act of reclamation. A quirky aside, British schools in India taught Shakespeare not for art, but for ethics. One colonial inspector proudly reported that his students could recite Julius Caesar with moral fervor. He forgot that the play ends with the fall of an empire. You move north to Delhi again. The city hums under reconstruction, its ruins half buried under new British boulevards. The grand Mughal palaces have been converted into barracks and archives. Where emperors once ruled, clerks now file. The British have built their own miniature London here. Wide streets, clock towers, gardens trimmed with military precision. They call it New Delhi before it's even new. The symbolism isn't subtle. The Red Fort, once seat of Mughal glory, now houses the Union Jack. Its courtyards echo not with courtiers, but with marching boots. Yet in the shadows of the bazaar, poets still whisper verses that sound suspiciously like prophecy. A mainstream fact again. After 1877, Queen Victoria was formally declared Empress of India. The Delhi Durbar that celebrated the title was a spectacle of elephants, fireworks, and hypocrisy, an empire congratulating itself for being eternal. The Indian princes bowed, the British officers saluted, and the poor watched from behind fences, wondering what exactly had changed. You stand on the edge of that grand parade ground as fireworks explode above the city. A British officer nearby murmurs, "Now the sun will never set on the empire." You watch his reflection shimmer in a puddle and think, neither does darkness. Historians still argue whether the Raj was the pinnacle or the parody of British imperialism. Some call it a golden age of order, others the velvet glove of domination. To you, it feels like a play performed too long. The costumes still bright, the actors tired, the script fraying at the edges. A quirky tidbit, during the Delhi Durbar, one Indian prince accidentally arrived late and was seated among commoners. The British chronicler noted, order was maintained despite the error. No one asked how it felt to the prince. That's empire in a sentence. Mistakes dignified as discipline. The 1880s drift into the 1890s. Steamships grow faster, telegrams shorter, patience thinner. Famines strike again. Orissa, Madras, the Deccan, killing millions. British reports attribute it to natural causes, though nature never signed the tax ledgers. Relief comes slowly, bureaucratically, always too late. You visit one famine camp, children with arms like reeds, women staring blankly at bowls of rice that never arrive. A missionary writes in his diary, "The Lord tests India severely." You suspect the Lord has little to do with it. Still, the resistance remains quiet, smoldering beneath the weight of obedience. Educated Indians petition politely, reformers plead reasonably, and poets remind their readers softly that patience is not the same as peace. You stand on a railway platform at dusk, watching the trains thunder past, carrying soldiers, tea, and telegrams. Somewhere in those carriages sits a young law student reading Burke, another jotting a poem in Bengali, another wondering how long politeness can postpone revolution. The empire looks unshakable tonight, every bolt polished, every flag straight. But if you listen closely, beneath the roar of wheels and the hum of telegraph wires, you can already hear it, the faint, rhythmic beat of footsteps walking in the opposite direction. The train whistles fade into memory, and the century turns. It is the early 1900s now, and the empire stands tall, dressed in marble and confidence. The British Raj seems immovable, its bureaucracy sprawling, its army disciplined, its railways glinting like veins under sunlight. Yet beneath that iron order, India begins to murmur again. You can feel it in the cities first, in Calcutta's cafes, Bombay's lecture halls, and Delhi's courtyards, where men and women are starting to speak not as subjects, but as citizens. A mainstream historical fact. In 1885, just before the century turned, the Indian National Congress was founded. At first, it wasn't revolutionary. It was polite, even loyal. Its founders were lawyers, teachers, reformers, people who still believed that the British could be reasoned with. They petitioned for fairness, not freedom. But every ignored petition was a lesson. Every broken promise a seed. You find yourself inside one of those Congress meetings. The hall is warm and buzzing with earnest energy. Men in wool coats fan themselves with folded papers. Speeches blend English rhetoric with Sanskrit metaphor. A young delegate rises and declares, "We ask not for rebellion, but representation." The audience applauds. Outside, British police take notes. Historians still argue whether these early nationalists were naive or strategic. Some say they mistook courtesy for equality. Others believe they understood exactly what they were doing, using British ideals to expose British hypocrisy. You decide. It doesn't matter. What matters is that the conversation has changed. India is no longer silent. A quirky tidbit. British officials often referred to the Indian National Congress as a microscopic minority, confident it would fade away. They didn't realize that history's earthquakes often begin as whispers. The Raj responds with its usual mixture of paternalism and paranoia. Governors write reports about political unrest among the educated classes. They strengthened the police, tightened censorship, and opened more schools, all in the same breath. You walk through a printing press in Bombay, where workers print English grammar books by day and seditious pamphlets by night. The ink smells the same. You pause by a window as a new wind sweeps across the subcontinent. A moral one, quieter than rebellion, but far more enduring. In a small ashram in South Africa, a lawyer named Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi is learning that resistance doesn't need rifles. His philosophy of satyagraha, truth force, will return home soon like a tide coming back to shore. A mainstream fact again. Gandhi returned to India in 1915 and transformed the independence movement from elite petitions to mass participation. Under his leadership, politics became personal, woven into spinning wheels, salt, and silence. You follow Gandhi through the crowded streets of Ahmedabad, where workers on strike carry signs that simply read, "We will not fear." There are no guns, no barricades, just conviction. The British officers watching from the rooftops don't know how to react. You can't shoot a principle. Historians still argue whether Gandhi's nonviolence was strategy or spirituality. Some see him as a genius of optics, others as a moral revolutionary. Perhaps both are true. Empires understand violence. They struggle with dignity. A quirky aside, Gandhi's spinning wheel became so symbolic that British officers reportedly banned it from prisons, calling it a tool of sedition. Imagine fearing a thread. You walk through Delhi again, decades after the Sepoys' revolt. The Red Fort gleams under British maintenance, its stones scrubbed of rebellion, but not memory. At India Gate, a new memorial honors Indian soldiers who died for Britain in World War I. Over 1 million men sent across seas to fight for freedom they didn't yet have. A mainstream fact. Between 1914 and 1918, more than 1.3 million Indians served in the British Army, and nearly 74,000 died. Their sacrifice strengthened India's demand for recognition. After the war, Britain promised reforms, then delivered disappointment. The Rowlatt Acts of 1919 extended wartime repressive laws into peace. You're in Amritsar that spring. The city smells of jasmine and tension. In a public garden called Jallianwala Bagh, thousands gather peacefully to protest the new laws. Families sit on the grass, children eat sweets, speakers call for unity. Then the soldiers arrive. You hear the command, fire. No warning, no mercy. The bullets rip through the crowd for 10 minutes that last forever. When it ends, the garden is silent except for the moans of the dying. General Dyer's boots echo on the blood-soaked ground as he leaves without a word. Historians still argue whether Jallianwala was an atrocity or an accident. The Empire called it regrettable. India called it unforgettable. You look down at the dust and think how fitting that a garden, once a place for life, became the grave of Britain's moral authority. A quirky detail. After the massacre, Dyer's supporters in Britain raised a fund for him worth the modern equivalent of millions. They called it a gift of gratitude. Gratitude for what? You still can't say without bitterness. The 1920s arrive like a drumbeat. Gandhi launches the non-cooperation movement, calling on Indians to boycott British goods, schools, and offices. You walk through bazaars where people burn imported cloth and replace it with homespun khadi. It smells of smoke and liberation. The Raj trembles not from violence, but from vacancy. When millions stop cooperating, the machine starts to creak. A mainstream fact again. Between 1920 and 1922, British revenue collection dropped dramatically as Indians withdrew from government jobs and courts. Gandhi's movement turned economic dependency into moral resistance. You travel from village to village, watching the transformation. The British call it sedition. You call it awakening. Farmers refuse to pay taxes. Students quit British schools. Priests hold prayers for freedom beneath banyan trees. You hear the phrase Swaraj, self-rule, on every tongue, whispered like a blessing. Historians still argue whether Gandhi's movement was truly inclusive. Critics point out its limits, class divisions, caste barriers, the voices of women often silenced. Yet the movement's strength lies in its imperfection. It teaches millions that power is not divine, but negotiated. A quirky tidbit: Gandhi once halted his own movement after a mob killed British policemen at Chauri Chaura. He declared, "Freedom built on blood is not freedom." Many followers were furious, but he understood something crucial. Empire's violence cannot be defeated by imitation. Years roll forward. You see other faces now. Jawaharlal Nehru, sharp and restless. Subhash Chandra Bose, fierce and defiant. Sarojini Naidu, poet turned leader. The generation raised under British schools begins to rewrite the story their teachers told them. Each speech, each pamphlet, each jail sentence becomes another verse in India's unfinished hymn. Then comes the Salt March, 1930. You walk beside Gandhi as he trudges barefoot along dusty roads from Ahmedabad to the Arabian Sea. Villagers join one by one, the procession swelling like a river. At Dandi, he bends, lifts a handful of salt, and the world seems to shift on its axis. Such a small act, and yet it shakes an empire. A mainstream fact again. The Salt March covered 240 miles and sparked nationwide civil disobedience. Thousands were arrested, including Gandhi himself, but the image of him making salt by hand became a global symbol of defiance. You pause by the waves as the sun sets over the Indian Ocean. The air smells of salt and hope. You realize that what began centuries ago as a charter signed by Elizabeth I has led, inevitably, to this. A barefoot man by the sea, dismantling an empire grain by grain. Historians still argue whether Britain's rule brought modernity or merely delayed it. But you've walked the centuries, and you know the truth. India would have modernized on its own terms. The empire didn't plant the seeds, it only claimed the harvest. The 1940s arrive with war again. Hitler in Europe, rebellion in Asia, hunger in Bengal. Millions die in a famine the Raj blames on nature, but caused by policy. Britain wins the war, but loses its will. In 1947, as the sun rises over a partitioned land, India finally stands free and divided. A quirky aside, when the British lowered the Union Jack for the last time in Delhi, they forgot to take down the flagpole. Someone left it there, perhaps by habit, perhaps as apology. You stand in the twilight of empire, the air thick with incense and ash. The East India Company's story, 3 centuries of ambition, trade, and conquest, has come full circle. Its offices long closed, its coins tarnished, its name surviving only on corporate ledgers and historical footnotes. But its shadow still lingers, in systems, in borders, in languages. The trains still run on British rails. The laws still quote British codes. The bureaucracy still hums with that old, efficient indifference. Yet something deeper has changed. The people walk taller now, their silence replaced with speech, their fear with memory. You look out over the land once called the jewel in the crown. The crown is gone, but the light remains. And in that faint, forgiving dawn, you hear a whisper older than any empire. The earth remembers, even when men forget. You exhale slowly. The story drifts into stillness, like embers dimming after a long fire. The British ships have sailed. The company has folded into dust, and yet the echoes linger. Ledgers in museums, iron bridges spanning rivers, a language that still holds the rhythm of command. You imagine the clerk's ink drying, the soldier's boots rusting, the forts crumbling back into sand. The night feels softer now. The noise of centuries quiets to a hum. Trains far away perhaps, or the wind moving through old banyan leaves. The land has survived everything that tried to own it. Fields bloom again where armies marched. Children laugh where soldiers once drilled. The empire that claimed eternity lasted a heartbeat in history's clock. You stretch, feel your breath slow, and picture the Hooghly River winding out to sea. Its surface glows faintly under the moon, calm, endless, indifferent. All stories end this way, you think. Power fading, memory enduring. Maybe, as you drift towards sleep, you hear the faint growl of Tipu's wooden tiger somewhere in the distance, or the steady rhythm of a spinning wheel turning salt into freedom. Or maybe it's just the sound of the night reminding you that every empire, however mighty, must one day whisper the same final word.